Morning fog rolled heavily across Camp Woanakwa, swallowing the cabins, docks, and trees beneath a blanket of pale grey mist. The lake itself looked almost motionless, disturbed only by the occasional ripple against the shoreline. Most of the campers were still buried beneath blankets, clinging desperately to the last few moments of sleep before another miserable day at camp began. That peace lasted exactly 3 seconds. Rise and shine, campers. Today's challenge is all about suffering. Chris McLean's voice blasted through the loudspeakers with enough force to shake the walls of the cabins. Inside the boys' cabin, Owen jerked awake so violently that he rolled straight off the top bunk and crashed face first onto the floor. "WHY?" he cried miserably. Across camp, Gwen groaned and dragged a pillow over her head, trying to smother the noise entirely. It didn't help. Meanwhile, Courtney was already awake. Of course she was. She sat at the edge of her bunk tying her shoes with perfect precision, her expression calm and focused while chaos unfolded around her. Even at this hour, she looked prepared for battle. Outside, the campers slowly gathered near the campfire pit, shivering in the cold morning air. Chris stood proudly beside Chef Hatchet, grinning with the kind of excitement that usually meant someone was about to suffer greatly. Chef looked equally pleased. "Today," Chris announced dramatically, spreading his arms wide, "you'll compete in one of my personal favorite challenges. No pain, no game." The campers immediately groaned. The rules are simple. The more pain you endure, the more points you earn. Physical pain, emotional pain, psychological pain. If it hurts, it counts. Heather blinked slowly. "That sounds medically concerning."
Chef snorted.
"Good." Chris opened his mouth to continue, but before he could explain the challenge stations, the distant sound of a boat engine echoed across the lake. Every camper turned toward the docks. The fog shifted slowly as a small boat emerged from the mist, cutting through the water toward shore. 2 silhouettes stood near the front, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other moving around like a caffeinated squirrel. Owen's eyes widened in horror. No way. The boat slammed against the dock. Izzy cartwheeled off immediately, somehow landing upside down before springing perfectly back onto her feet. "Miss me, my beautiful little forest goblins," she shouted cheerfully. Behind her, Eva stepped onto the dock and cracked her knuckles loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm back," she growled. Her glare swept across the campers before stopping directly on the former Killer Base members. More specifically, Courtney and Bridget. The tension hit instantly. Even the fog suddenly felt colder. The merge had changed the structure of the game completely. There were no official teams anymore, no guaranteed alliances, and no safe groups to hide behind. Every contestant now existed in a shifting battlefield of temporary loyalties and silent betrayals. But while the teams were gone, old grudges remained very much alive. Eva remembered exactly who had voted her off. Courtney met Eva's stare without the slightest hint of fear. Her arms crossed neatly over her chest as she stood her ground, calm and unmoving. Bridget, on the other hand, instinctively took a small step backward. Heather noticed immediately. Unlike Lindsay, who often relied on charm and instinct, Heather had become increasingly observant over the past few weeks. She paid attention to fear, to hesitation, to weakness. Quietly, she moved a little closer to Bridget. "You okay?" Heather asked softly. Bridget sighed under her breath. "Eva still hates us." "She kind of hates everyone," Gwen muttered nearby. "That's not true," Izzy chirped happily. "She also hates nature documentaries." Eva ignored all of them. Her eyes never left Courtney. "You," Eva said flatly. Courtney raised an eyebrow. "You were a liability. And you're annoying." Bridget fully expected Courtney to snap back immediately. Earlier in the season, she absolutely would have. Courtney's temper used to ignite at the smallest insult. But instead, Courtney smirked. "Good," she replied evenly. "That means you still care about losing." Eva narrowed her eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Bridget blinked in surprise. Somewhere during the past several weeks, Courtney had changed. She was still ambitious, still intense, still impossibly competitive. But without Harold rigging her elimination earlier in the season, she had stayed in the game long enough to evolve naturally beneath the pressure. Every challenge had sharpened her instincts. Every betrayal had taught her restraint. She no longer exploded emotionally at every conflict. Now she controlled herself, which somehow made her even more dangerous. Bridget had started noticing it during challenges. Courtney protected allies who proved useful. She planned several moves ahead. She understood when to push people and when to back off. And unlike Lindsay, Courtney never manipulated emotions for entertainment. She manipulated to win. There was a difference. Oddly enough, Bridget respected it. Chris finally unveiled the challenge stations with theatrical excitement, while Chef pulled tarps off one horrifying setup after another. First, Chris announced, "We have the classic hot coal sprint." A narrow path of glowing red coals crackled ominously nearby. Then we move onto and hill endurance. Several campers visibly recoiled. After that, you'll survive Chef's personal boot camp, eat painfully spicy peppers, and finally wrestle a series of mechanical attack devices. Owen looked genuinely horrified. This feels illegal.
Chef grinned.
Probably. The challenge began almost immediately. Screaming echoed across camp within minutes. Heather stood nervously near the hot coal station, staring down at the burning path ahead of her. Heat shimmered violently in the air while smoke curled upward from the stones. But before she could fully psych herself up, Lindsay walked past her. Then followed. The heat hit immediately. Halfway across, Heather yelped as pain shot through her feet. She nearly lost balance. But Lindsay caught her arm before she could fall completely. For a brief second, Heather stared at her in surprise. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "Thanks." Lindsay released her almost immediately. "Don't mention it." Her voice sounded casual, but her expression afterward became strangely unreadable. Because somewhere deep down, Lindsay genuinely did not want Heather to get hurt. And realizing that annoyed her far more than the burns. The true spectacle of the day came during the combat endurance round. Chris and Chef had transformed part of the forest into a chaotic obstacle arena filled with paintball turrets, hidden traps, swinging hazards, and malfunctioning mechanical animals. The goal was simple. Survive. Eva dominated immediately. She bulldozed through obstacles like a human wrecking ball, smashing through barricades instead of avoiding them. Paintballs exploded harmlessly against nearby trees as she powered forward through the course with terrifying aggression. "She's insane," Trent whispered. Gwen shook her head slightly. "No. She's motivated." Eva's focus centered entirely on one objective: destroying Courtney. Meanwhile, Courtney approached the course completely differently. Where Eva used force, Courtney used precision. She studied trap timing carefully, watched movement patterns, and used the environment intelligently. Every dodge looked calculated. Every movement served a purpose. The competition between them intensified with every station. Then disaster struck. One of Chef's animatronic bear obstacles suddenly malfunctioned. Its glowing eyes flickered violently before it turned away from the programmed route and charged directly toward the contestants. Several campers screamed and scattered instantly. Owen nearly trampled Jeff trying to escape. But Courtney didn't move. Something sharp flashed across her expression. Not fear. Excitement. "Move," she shouted. The mechanical bear lunged toward her. And Courtney charged directly at it. The entire camp stared in disbelief as she collided with the machine head-on, tackling it into the mud with pure adrenaline and stubborn determination. Metal screeched while dirt sprayed everywhere as the animatronic creature thrashed wildly beneath her. Courtney gritted her teeth and held on. For several seconds, it looked completely insane. Then Chef finally reached the machine and shut it down. Silence spread across the forest. Courtney slowly stood up, covered head to toe in mud and breathing heavily from exertion. Even Duncan looked impressed. "Okay," he admitted. "That was hardcore." Bridget stared at Courtney wide-eyed. Not because Courtney had won, but because she had enjoyed it. There was something different underneath Courtney's perfection now. Something fierce, competitive, almost feral whenever she was challenged directly. For the first time, Bridget caught a glimpse of the stronger, tougher version of Courtney that would eventually emerge fully in later seasons. Courtney pushed wet hair out of her face and calmly adjusted her appearance like nothing had happened. Bridget burst out laughing. Courtney looked offended for exactly 2 seconds before she started laughing too. It was small, brief, but genuine. And for the first time all season, neither of them felt like enemies. From that moment onward, something subtle shifted between them. Despite dominating most of the challenges, Eva had one major problem. Everyone was terrified of her. She played too aggressively, won too forcefully. Unlike Lindsay or Courtney, Eva lacked the social awareness necessary to soften her threat level. Every victory only made the others more nervous about keeping her around. By evening, the decision had practically made itself. Even players who respected Eva didn't want to risk sitting beside her near the finale. As the campers gathered around the fire pit for the elimination ceremony, tension hung heavily in the air. Chris smirked dramatically while holding the tray of marshmallows. Eva. He tossed her a marshmallow. Courtney. Another marshmallow flew through the air. Lindsay. Gwen. Heather. One by one, contestants were declared safe while the fire crackled softly beside them. Eva remained motionless as the final marshmallow never came. Chris spread his arms theatrically. And that means Eva is once again taking the dock of shame. Eva stood slowly.
No screaming.
No rage-filled meltdown. Only disappointment. Before leaving, she looked directly at Courtney. You beat the bear. Courtney nodded carefully. For the first time all day, Eva smirked faintly. Not bad. It was probably the closest thing to genuine respect Eva had ever offered another contestant. Then she turned, boarded the boat, and disappeared into the foggy darkness beyond the lake. And as Heather quietly glanced between Lindsay, Courtney, Gwen, and Bridget, one realization settled heavily in her mind. Trust was becoming far more dangerous than strength. The lake churned violently against the docks, waves slamming against the wood hard enough to spray icy water into the air. Even the cabin seemed quieter than usual, as if the island itself understood that something ugly was waiting just ahead. The merge had changed everything. There were no teams anymore. No walls separating enemies from allies. No guarantees of safety beyond a single challenge win. Every conversation now carried hidden motives beneath it. Every glance held suspicion, and every friendship had become another tool waiting to be used. Out here, emotions were weaknesses, and relationships were weapons. Trent sat alone at the end of the dock that morning, his guitar balanced lazily across his lap while his fingers moved absent-mindedly across the strings. The melody drifting through the cold air sounded unfinished, repeating itself over and over as though he couldn't quite figure out where the song wanted to go. A few feet away, Gwen leaned against the railing with her arms folded loosely across her chest. Her dark hair blew across her face with every gust of wind, but for once she didn't seem annoyed by it. She simply listened quietly, her expression softer than the guarded look she usually wore around everyone else. You keep replaying the same chord, she observed after a while. Trent glanced up with an embarrassed smile. Yeah. I keep thinking the next part's gonna come to me, but it never does. Gwen shrugged lightly. Maybe it's already good the way it is. Trent looked at her then, really looked at her, and something warm settled into the silence between them. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't forced. Being around Gwen had never felt difficult for him, and somehow that mattered more out here than almost anything else. Over the course of the competition, they had drifted closer naturally. There had been no strategy behind it, no manipulation or alliance calculations. They simply understood each other in a way neither of them expected. Gwen trusted very few people on the island, but Trent had slowly become one of the rare exceptions. Which was exactly why Lindsay couldn't stand it. It wasn't because Gwen and Trent were strategically dangerous. They weren't controlling votes or dominating challenges. They weren't even particularly influential compared to players like Courtney or Duncan. Lindsay simply hated Gwen. The rivalry between them had stopped being about the game a long time ago. Every interaction now carried tension sharp enough to cut through the air itself. Their smiles never reached their eyes. Their conversation sounded polite on the surface while hiding insults underneath every word. Gwen represented something Lindsay despised deeply. Someone she couldn't fully control. And Lindsay hated feeling powerless more than anything. Chris gathered the merged campers near the forest shortly after breakfast, grinning with the kind of excitement that usually meant somebody's suffering was about to become entertainment. Campers, he announced dramatically, spreading his arms wide. Today's challenge is a scavenger hunt. Hidden keys are scattered all over Camp Wawanakwa. Find one, unlock your treasure chest, and you win immunity. The contestants immediately exploded into motion. Courtney began barking strategies to herself before sprinting toward the woods like she was entering military combat. Duncan instantly started looking for ways to cheat before the challenge had even properly begun. Owen somehow tripped over absolutely nothing within the first 30 seconds. As everyone scattered into the forest, Heather lingered behind near the edge of camp, watching cautiously. Then Lindsay caught her wrist. "I need your help," Lindsay said quietly. Heather turned toward her, already uneasy from the tone alone. "Help with what?" Lindsay's gaze shifted toward Gwen and Trent disappearing together between the trees. "I'm ending that." Heather's stomach tightened instantly.
No.
Lindsay blinked slowly, almost surprised she'd been challenged at all.
No.
You can't just hurt people because you don't like them. Lindsay folded her arms across her chest. This is the game. No, Heather replied, her voice softer but firmer this time. This is personal. For the briefest moment, irritation flickered across Lindsay's face. It vanished almost immediately, replaced by something colder and sharper. You know, Lindsay said casually, I could replace you very easily. Heather froze. Lindsay stepped closer, lowering her voice. People like me. They trust me. If I wanted another ally, I could find one in an hour. The words hit Heather harder than she wanted to admit, because part of her believed them. Most of her life had been spent feeling replaceable, forgettable, the person people overlooked the moment someone prettier, louder, or more confident entered the room. Lindsay knew exactly where those insecurities lived inside her, and she pressed against them effortlessly. I picked you because you're useful, Lindsay continued softly. But if you start becoming difficult... She let the sentence hang unfinished. Heather lowered her eyes. Not because she agreed. Because she was afraid. And Lindsay noticed immediately. A small satisfied smile curved across her lips. Good, she said quietly. Now help me. The scavenger hunt unfolded chaotically across the island. Campers tore through bushes, climbed trees, dug through mud pits, and searched abandoned corners of Camp Wawanakwa for hidden keys. Owen somehow managed to get himself trapped upside down inside a hollow log while trying to retrieve what turned out to be a pine cone. Courtney treated the challenge like a high-level tactical operation, mapping out search patterns in the dirt with a stick. Duncan ignored half the rules entirely whenever Chris wasn't looking. Meanwhile, Gwen and Trent kept finding themselves together no matter where they searched. Every time one of them discovered a clue or reached a new section of the island, the other somehow wasn't far behind. Their conversations came easily, relaxed and natural despite the stress of the game surrounding them. From a distance, Lindsay watched carefully. Then she moved. Trent, she called brightly. Trent turned in surprise. Hey. Lindsay smiled sweetly as she pointed toward the cliffs. I think I found something near the rocks, but I can't reach it alone. Can you help me? Behind her, Heather stood near the trees with her arms folded tightly against herself. Every instinct inside her screamed to stop this before it happened. But fear rooted her in place. Trent hesitated for only a second before nodding. Sure. And that single moment was enough, because Gwen saw him follow Lindsay toward the cliffs. The wind near the cliffside roared violently, tugging at clothing and whipping hair across their faces as Trent stepped carefully across the uneven rocks. So where is it? He asked, scanning the area. Lindsay pointed vaguely toward the edge. I think it's down there somewhere. Trent leaned slightly to look over the rocks. I don't see any. Lindsay grabbed the front of his shirt suddenly and pulled him into a kiss. It happened fast. Deliberate. Calculated. Trent's eyes widened immediately in complete shock. And at that exact moment, Gwen emerged from the tree line. Everything stopped. The wind. The noise. The movement of the world itself. Gwen stared at them in horror, her expression collapsing almost instantly. Trent jerked backwards so quickly he nearly lost his footing. Gwen, wait. But Gwen was already running. Not furious at first. Just hurt. The kind of hurt that reached somewhere deep and personal. Heather watched Gwen disappear into the forest, guilt twisting painfully inside her chest. Trent rounded on Lindsay in disbelief, anger flashing across his face. What is wrong with you? Lindsay calmly brushed imaginary dust from her sleeve as though nothing important had happened. You should probably go after your girlfriend. Then she walked away smiling. Gwen sat alone behind the cabins long after the challenge had continued elsewhere on the island. Her knees were pulled tightly against her chest while silent tears slid down her face. She hated crying. Especially here. Especially where people could see her vulnerable. But betrayal felt different when it came from the one person you finally allowed yourself to trust. Bridget found her first. Without saying anything, she quietly sat down beside Gwen in the grass. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The only sound came from the distant wind moving through the trees overhead. Finally, Gwen whispered, I saw him kiss her. Bridget's expression hardened immediately. Oh, that is low. Gwen laughed bitterly through her tears. Maybe I'm just stupid. No, Bridget said firmly. People who cheat are the worst kind of cowards. At that exact moment, one of the nearby production cameras zoomed slightly closer. Bridget noticed instantly, and immediately realized how terrible that sentence sounded considering Jeff was still somewhere else on the island. Her face paled. I mean, not all people who, okay, wow, that came out wrong. Even through her tears, Gwen let out a weak snort of laughter. For a moment, the pain eased slightly. Only slightly. By evening, the challenge finally came to an end when Heather discovered one of the final hidden keys buried beneath the old canoe dock near the shore. Chris practically bounced with excitement as he handed her the immunity pass. Heather wins immunity. The reactions around camp were mixed at best. Courtney looked annoyed. Duncan looked suspicious. Lindsay looked pleased. Heather barely reacted at all, because she already knew what was coming next. The vote. And worse than that, Lindsay expected protection. Before the elimination ceremony began, Heather confronted Lindsay alone near the campfire while the others gathered nearby. "You humiliated Gwen," Heather said quietly. Lindsay shrugged without concern. "She'll survive." "You manipulated Trent." That part was easy. Heather stared at her in disbelief, disturbed by how casually the words were delivered. "You don't even feel bad." Lindsay tilted her head slightly. "Would you rather I leave tonight?" Heather opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. Because strategically, Lindsay wasn't wrong. Everyone hated her, which made her useful. Players focused on obvious villains first while quieter threats slipped through unnoticed. Keeping Lindsay close gave Heather protection whether she liked admitting it or not. And Lindsay knew she was smart enough to understand that. "I need you," Lindsay said softly. That was the terrifying part. For once, Heather honestly couldn't tell if Lindsay was manipulating her or telling the truth. The campfire burned brightly beneath the dark night sky as the campers gathered for the elimination ceremony. Tension sat heavy in the air, especially around Trent. He looked exhausted, confused, and desperate all at once. "I didn't kiss her back," he tried explaining quietly to Gwen before the ceremony began. "I swear." Gwen refused to meet his eyes. Chris stepped forward with the tray of marshmallows, grinning like this was the greatest night of his life. "One by one, campers. If I call your name, you're safe." "Heather." Heather stood slowly as Chris handed her the marshmallow. Then, without hesitation, she turned and walked directly toward Lindsay. The entire camp watched in stunned silence as Heather placed the immunity pass into Lindsay's hands. The reaction was immediate. "What?" Courtney snapped. "You've got to be kidding me," Duncan muttered. Even Gwen looked genuinely betrayed. Lindsay, meanwhile, simply smiled. Smooth. Calm. Victorious. Chris burst into loud laughter. "Well, that changes everything." Now Lindsay couldn't be voted out. And suddenly, there was only one obvious target left. Chris continued handing out marshmallows. Courtney. Gwen. Bridget. Duncan. Owen. Jeff. Only Trent remained standing. Chris glanced dramatically at the empty tray before looking up. No marshmallow for Trent. Silence settled over the campfire. Trent looked toward Gwen one final time, heartbreak written plainly across his face. "I swear, I didn't choose that." Gwen's expression cracked slightly, because deep down, she believed him. But sometimes belief wasn't enough to undo damage once it had already been done. Trent boarded the boat of losers quietly, disappearing into the darkness beneath the cold night sky. And as the boat drifted farther away across the lake, Heather sat beside the fire feeling colder than ever before. Because for the first time since the game began, she wasn't sure Lindsay could still be saved. Back when there were teams, betrayals could still be hidden behind group decisions. Votes could be blamed on strategy, on numbers, on bad luck. Nobody ever had to admit who they truly wanted gone because the teams absorbed the guilt for them. Every elimination had become personal. And after Trent's departure the previous night, trust around camp had shattered completely. Especially around Heather. Especially around Lindsay. Breakfast that morning unfolded beneath a silence so uncomfortable even Owen barely spoke. Spoons scraped softly against bowls while contestants avoided eye contact as if looking at the wrong person for too long might somehow expose weakness. At the far end of the picnic table, Gwen sat alone with a bowl of cereal slowly turning soggy in front of her. Dark circles lingered beneath her eyes from lack of sleep, and every now and then she stirred the cereal absent-mindedly without taking a bite. Nearby, Jeff and Bridget whispered quietly to each other, their heads close together. Whatever safety existed in the game now came from pairs and partnerships, and everyone knew it. Courtney sat perfectly upright with a tiny makeshift notebook resting in her lap, scribbling challenge possibilities onto scraps of paper she had somehow collected over the past few days. She looked less like a contestant and more like someone preparing for war. And Duncan noticed all of it. He leaned back against the bench, watching the campers carefully beneath half-lidded eyes while Chef stomped around pouring burnt coffee into tin mugs. Duncan counted numbers automatically. More girls than boys remained. He hated those odds immediately. Quietly, he leaned closer toward Jeff and DJ. "We need an alliance," he muttered.
DJ blinked. En alliance.
"A guy alliance," Duncan clarified. "Look around. If the girls decide to work together, we are screwed." Jeff rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully before glancing around the table. "You really think they'd team up?" Duncan's eyes flickered toward Heather and Lindsay. "Maybe not officially," he admitted. "But eventually? Yeah. And if they do, we are getting picked off one at a time."
DJ shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, man."
Alliances get ugly fast. Duncan snorted softly. "You want to get eliminated playing nice." That ended the discussion. Nobody trusted Duncan completely, but trust barely mattered anymore. Survival did. After a long pause, Jeff finally nodded once. "All right," he said quietly.
Temporary alliance.
DJ sighed heavily before agreeing too, though his expression made it obvious he already hated the idea. Across the table, Heather noticed the conversation instantly. And that worried her. Just before noon, Chris gathered the remaining campers near the edge of the forest with the kind of grin that usually meant pain was coming. "Campers," he announced dramatically. "Today's challenge is called Hide and Be Sneaky." Chef stood beside him carrying military-grade tracking equipment that absolutely should not have existed on a reality show. His grin made several contestants visibly nervous. "The rules are simple," Chris continued cheerfully. "You hide somewhere on the island. Chef hunts you down. Last camper found wins immunity." Owen immediately raised his hand. "What if Chef finds us right away?" Chef cracked his knuckles loudly. "Then you lose right away." Owen whimpered. The second Chris yelled go, the contestants exploded into motion, scattering into the forest in every direction. Branches snapped beneath hurried footsteps while nervous voices disappeared deeper into the island. Heather moved carefully through the woods, far calmer than most of the others. Unlike players who relied on panic or luck, she approached challenges strategically. Every movement she made had purpose. She studied terrain, sight lines, blind spots. Years of spending school life unnoticed had sharpened skills she rarely admitted possessing. When people ignored you long enough, you learn how they behaved when they weren't paying attention. You noticed patterns, habits, weaknesses. Eventually, she found the perfect hiding place near the swamp, a collapsed section of old dock wood half buried in mud and reeds. The entrance was naturally concealed, and the swamp water masked scent trails well enough that even Chef would struggle to track her immediately. Heather carefully slid underneath the broken wood and finally allowed herself a small breath of relief. For the first time all day, she felt safe. Then she heard branches snapping nearby. Heather froze. A second later, Lindsay stumbled out of the trees looking sweaty, irritated, and covered in mosquito bites. "I hate this challenge," Lindsay whispered loudly. "There are bugs everywhere." Heather's eyes widened in horror. "Shush." Lindsay blinked innocently. "Why?" "Because this hiding spot is good." "Oh." The realization arrived 1 second too late. From somewhere deeper in the swamp came Chef's voice. "I heard somebody." Heather closed her eyes slowly, every ounce of frustration draining through her body. Heavy footsteps crashed through the reeds moments later. Then Chef burst through the swamp brush like an angry bear. "Found why." Mud splashed everywhere as Chef dragged both girls out from hiding while Chris's distant laughter echoed through the trees. Heather stared at Lindsay in absolute disbelief. And something inside her finally snapped. "Are you serious?" Heather exploded. "You couldn't stay quiet for 5 seconds." Lindsay froze immediately. Heather almost never raised her voice, which somehow made it worse when she did. "You ruin everything when you stop thinking." Heather continued, stress pouring out faster than she could control it. "Do you understand how dangerous this game is right now? We are already targets." The words hit harder than she intended, because Lindsay's expression changed instantly. Not angry, not defensive. Hurt. Real hurt. Chef marched away, announcing their elimination while silence settled awkwardly between the two girls. The second Heather saw Lindsay looking away, guilt punched through her anger almost immediately. "Oh no." Lindsay crossed her arms tightly and refused to meet her eyes. Heather stepped closer carefully. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean that." No response. Heather swallowed hard before speaking again, softer this time. "I'm stressed," she admitted. "We don't have protection anymore. Everybody already wants us gone. The second one of us loses immunity, they'll come after us." That finally got Lindsay's attention. Because beneath her cheerful persona and manipulative charm, she understood the truth too. The others did not merely dislike them anymore. They feared them. Courtney viewed them as strategic threats. Gwen hated them personally. Duncan distrusted them instinctively. And players like Jeff and DJ would follow whichever vote kept them safest. Slowly, Lindsay uncrossed her arms. "So we need shields," she murmured. Heather nodded once. Lindsay's eyes sharpened immediately, strategy returning behind the smile. "The boys." Heather realized instantly that Lindsay was right. The rest of the afternoon became a quiet battle of social maneuvering. Heather approached Owen first because he was the easiest to influence. Owen genuinely liked almost everyone, but Heather understood something important. People became loyal when they felt valued. After Owen got discovered hiding inside a garbage barrel behind the mess hall, Heather helped brush mud off his shirt while Chris mocked him from across camp. "People underestimate you," Heather said honestly. Owen blinked in surprise. "You think I'm strategic?" Heather gave a small shrug. "I think you're loyal." Owen smiled immediately. And just like that, Heather knew she had him. Meanwhile, Lindsay focused on Jeff. Unlike Owen, Jeff required finesse. She found him near the docks waiting for Bridget to finish hiding and casually leaned beside him against the railing. "You know," Lindsay said thoughtfully, "people see you as harmless." Jeff frowned slightly. Thanks." "No, seriously," Lindsay continued smoothly. "That's actually powerful. Nobody notices social players until it's too late." Jeff blinked, clearly caught off guard. Nobody had ever framed his friendliness as strategy before. Lindsay smiled softly. "And honestly, I'd rather work with someone fun than someone controlling." The subtle jab toward Courtney landed perfectly. By evening, both girls had quietly secured something valuable. Not complete alliances. Not trust. But connections. And in a game like this, connections kept you alive. While the others scrambled emotionally, Courtney approached the challenge like a military operation. She studied search routes, wind direction,
Terrain visibility.
escape options. Eventually, she chose the lake. Specifically, the freezing water beneath the dock supports. For hours, Courtney remained partially submerged in icy water, breathing through a hollow reed while her muscles trembled violently from the cold. Every few minutes, Chef's footsteps thundered overhead, but he never looked beneath the dock until nearly sunset. When he finally discovered her, Courtney could barely climb onto the wood platform. But she was smiling. Chris looked genuinely impressed. That, he admitted, was hardcore. Courtney shivered violently while pushing soaked hair away from her face. "Preparation," she answered through chattering teeth, "matters." And just like that, immunity belonged to her again. As darkness settled across camp, strategy discussions erupted everywhere. The boys gathered first near the fire pit. Duncan leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Bridget," he said bluntly. Jeff immediately shook his head.
No.
Duncan frowned. "Why not?" "Because she's not a threat. She's socially connected." "So are Gwen and Courtney," Jeff fired back instantly.
They nodded slowly.
"He's got a point." Duncan exhaled sharply, already irritated. The truth was painfully obvious to everyone except maybe Courtney herself. Duncan did not want Courtney gone. Because he liked her. Jeff noticed immediately. "You're protecting Courtney." "I'm not." "You totally are." DJ tried and failed to hide a laugh. Duncan glared at both of them before throwing his hands into the air.
Fine.
Gwen then. And honestly, strategically, it made sense. Gwen stood alone now. Trent was gone. LaShawna was gone. Bridget cared about her but prioritized Jeff. Courtney respected Gwen competitively, yet distrusted her strategically. And Lindsay openly targeted her. Gwen had become isolated, which made her vulnerable. The campfire ceremony that night felt colder than usual. Even the flames seemed weaker. Gwen already knew. Sometimes players could sense when the game had turned against them. It lived in the silence between conversations, in the way nobody fully met your eyes. Chris called names one by one while tossing marshmallows into waiting hands. Courtney. Heather. Lindsay. Jeff. Bridget. Owen. Duncan. Each name tightened the knot in Gwen's chest further. Then silence. Only Gwen remained seated. No marshmallow waited for her. Chris grinned theatrically toward the cameras. Looks like Gwen's heading to the dock of shame. Nobody celebrated. Nobody even moved. Slowly, Gwen stood from the log bench. Unlike Trent's elimination, she did not look shocked. Only exhausted. Before walking away, she stopped briefly beside Heather. "You could have stopped her," Gwen said quietly. Heather's stomach twisted instantly because part of her knew Gwen was right. Then Gwen turned toward Lindsay. "And eventually," Gwen continued coldly, "she'll do the same thing to you." For the first time in days, Lindsay failed to smile. Gwen boarded the boat without another word. The engine started moments later, carrying her slowly across the dark lake while the campfire flickered behind her like dying embers. Heather sat silently beside the flames long after everyone else began leaving. Something unfamiliar had begun growing inside her chest. Not guilt. Doubt. Doubt about Lindsay. Doubt about herself. And doubt about how much further this game would force them to fall before it finally ended. The morning after Gwen's elimination settled over Camp Wawanakwa like a fog that refused to lift. Even the island itself seemed quieter than usual, the wind weaker through the trees, the cabin strangely hollow without the constant tension Gwen had carried with her. The quieter contestants had been eliminated one after another until only the strongest personalities remained. Alliances no longer resembled friendships. Every smile hid strategy. Every conversation carried suspicion beneath it. Even the people sitting beside each other at breakfast measured every word carefully, wondering whether they were speaking to a partner or the person preparing to stab them in the back at the next ceremony. Nobody at Camp Wawanakwa felt safe anymore. Chris McLean stood waiting near the main field with the kind of grin that usually meant somebody's dignity was about to be destroyed for ratings. Beside him sat a massive pile of rusted metal, snapped chains, crooked handlebars, loose wheels, and random mechanical scraps that looked less like sporting equipment and more like the aftermath of a violent junkyard explosion. Chef stood nearby with his arms crossed, looking deeply unimpressed by all of it. "Good morning, campers," Chris announced cheerfully, spreading his arms wide like a game show host unveiling a luxury prize instead of a probable medical emergency. Today's challenge is all about style, speed, and not dying horribly. Several contestants immediately groaned. Chef grabbed a top and yanked it away dramatically. Underneath sat several bicycles in varying stages of destruction. One had no seat. Another appeared to be missing an entire wheel. A third looked as though someone had driven it off a cliff and then attempted to repair it with kitchen utensils. Owen stared blankly at the pile for several seconds before finally speaking. "Those are bicycles." "They were," Chef answered flatly. Chris pointed excitedly toward the scrap pile. "Each of you will build your very own custom bike and race through Camp Wawanakwa's extreme obstacle course. Last person standing wins immunity." Jeff laughed loudly, shaking his head. "This challenge is completely ridiculous." "Correct," Chris replied instantly, firing finger guns at him. "That's why it's television." The moment Chris gave the signal, the contestants rushed toward the pile of parts. Courtney immediately took control of the situation with military precision. She knelt in the dirt beside the scrap heap, sketching quick structural designs with a stick while organizing useful pieces into neat categories. Her movements were fast, efficient, and aggressive, like she genuinely intended to engineer the perfect machine capable of surviving a war zone. Duncan, meanwhile, barely pretended to care about safety. "Brakes are for cowards," he declared while attaching something highly illegal looking to the side of his bike. Owen somehow found 2 decorative horns and an old frying pan, both of which he proudly bolted onto his frame for reasons even he probably didn't understand. Across the junkyard, Lindsay calmly sat down on a wooden crate and crossed her legs elegantly as if she were relaxing at a spa instead of participating in a competition. "Heather," she called casually, not even looking up from her nails, "make mine." Heather froze halfway through tightening a bolt. "What?" "You're good at this stuff," Lindsay replied lazily. "And I need something cute." For a second, Heather simply stared at her in disbelief. "You want me to build your bike while I'm building my own?" Lindsay finally glanced up, blinking innocently. "You work better under pressure anyway." A few weeks ago, Heather probably would have laughed nervously and agreed without hesitation. Back then, pleasing Lindsay still felt rewarding somehow. Back then, She could still convince herself the relationship was balanced, that the affection Lindsay occasionally showed was genuine enough to justify everything else. Now, though, something twisted painfully inside her chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just exhaustion. Even so, Heather slowly nodded and moved toward Lindsay's pile of parts without arguing further. Because despite every warning sign, despite every moment that should have forced her to face reality, despite Gwen's voice echoing in the back of her mind warning her not to trust someone who only cared about herself, Heather still wanted to believe Lindsay cared about her. Even a little. Nearby, Bridget struggled helplessly with her own bike frame. Every time she fixed one problem, another piece immediately fell apart. One wheel collapsed sideways while she tightened the pedals, and a chain snapped loose the moment she tried testing the handlebars. Bridget dropped her head into her hands with a miserable groan. This challenge hates me. Jeff wandered over carrying his own half-finished handlebars. His bike already looked terrible, though he didn't seem remotely concerned about it. You attached the pedals backwards, he explained carefully. Bridget looked up slowly. That's possible. Jeff laughed softly before kneeling beside her. Move over. Together, they rebuilt the frame piece by piece. Jeff handled most of the difficult repairs while Bridget passed him tools and occasionally distracted both of them with jokes that made them laugh harder than they probably should have. Their conversation drifted naturally between teasing and encouragement, easy and comfortable in a way that felt increasingly rare inside the competition. By the time they finished, Bridget's bike actually looked functional. Jeff's own bike looked significantly worse than before. Neither of them seemed to care. From across the junkyard, Courtney glanced toward them briefly. Something softer flickered across her expression for less than a second before she caught herself and immediately returned to work with renewed intensity. The obstacle course Chris revealed afterward looked less like a race and more like an attempted insurance scam. Massive mud pits stretched across the opening section. Wooden ramps leaned at dangerous angles over shallow ravines. Exploding barrels lined sharp turns for absolutely no practical reason whatsoever. At one point, live chickens had somehow been incorporated into the course design. Chris proudly called it art. Chef called it a lawsuit waiting to happen. The race began with immediate catastrophe. Owen crashed directly into a tree less than 30 seconds after the starting horn sounded. Somehow, the frying pan detached from his bike during impact and hit him in the face on the rebound. Duncan cheated so openly it barely even counted as cheating anymore. At one point he skipped half the course entirely by riding through the forest while flipping off Chris every time the host yelled at him. Courtney attacked the challenge like a soldier storming enemy territory, weaving through obstacles with terrifying focus while barking insults at anyone who slowed her down. And Lindsay's bike. The bike Heather had spent most of her own building time repairing. Performed flawlessly. The wheels turned smoothly. The frame stayed stable over rough terrain. It glided through mud pits and ramps effortlessly while the other bikes rattled apart around it. Heather's own bike, however, barely held itself together. Metal bolts shook violently every few seconds. The handlebars constantly twisted sideways. Halfway through the race, the seat literally snapped off completely, forcing Heather to continue standing awkwardly while trying not to crash into a lake. Even then, she still shouted encouragement toward Lindsay whenever they crossed paths. "You're doing great." Heather yelled breathlessly. Lindsay sped ahead without even looking back. By the final stretch, the contestants were exhausted, muddy, bruised, and barely functioning. The last obstacle involved launching their bikes off a wooden ramp over shark-infested water because apparently Chris had decided ordinary danger was no longer entertaining enough. Lindsay cleared the jump perfectly. Seconds later, she crossed the finish line first. Chris grabbed her wrist dramatically and raised her arm into the air. Lindsay wins immunity. The campers reacted with scattered frustration and tired applause. Most of them looked too exhausted to care much anymore. Heather smiled weakly despite everything. She had helped her closest ally survive another round. Maybe that loyalty would finally matter. Maybe all the sacrifices she kept making actually meant something to Lindsay after all. Chris waited until everyone gathered near the finish line before speaking again. "Oh, one more thing." An immediate chorus of groans answered him. Chris's grin widened. Today's loser automatically goes home. The atmosphere changed instantly. Confusion spread across the group before realization slowly settled in. Heather's broken bicycle still lay abandoned near the edge of the course. Last place. Heather blinked slowly, the blood draining from her face. What? Chris checked his clipboard with fake professionalism. According to challenge rules, Heather is officially eliminated. The world seemed to tilt sideways beneath her feet. No, wait. Her voice cracked apart halfway through the sentence. This wasn't a vote. Nope. Chris answered happily. Bummer, huh? Panic slammed into Heather's chest hard enough to make breathing difficult. Almost instinctively, she turned toward Lindsay. Of course she did. Lindsay was her ally. Her closest friend. The person Heather had protected repeatedly even when nobody else would. You have immunity, Heather said desperately, stepping closer. You can give it to me. The entire camp fell silent. Lindsay's expression barely changed. Heather swallowed hard, her composure beginning to crack visibly around the edges. Please. There was no manipulation in her voice anymore. No strategy.
No prive.
Only desperation. I helped you, she whispered shakily. I built your bike. I protected you. I voted with you every single time. Lindsay studied her quietly for several long seconds. Then she shook her head once.
No.
The single word hit harder than any elimination ceremony ever had. Heather stared at her in stunned disbelief. You're seriously letting me go? Lindsay crossed her arms carefully. If I save you, I lose immunity. Heather laughed once, but the sound came out broken and hollow. So that's it. You knew this was a game. No, Heather snapped suddenly, emotion finally erupting through her voice. I thought we were friends. For the first time all season, Lindsay had no immediate response ready. And somehow, that silence hurt more than if she had argued back. Everything Heather had buried for weeks shattered apart at once. The loneliness, the fear, the humiliation of constantly giving more than she received. The guilt she carried for every compromise she made trying to keep someone beside her. You used me, Heather said shakily.
No.
Yes, you did. Her voice exploded across the camp so loudly even Chris looked startled. I defended you when everybody hated you. I ignored every horrible thing you did because I thought underneath all that manipulation there was still a person in there. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody joked. Even Duncan stayed silent. Heather's composure collapsed completely. And all you ever cared about was yourself. Lindsay's jaw tightened slightly. Lower your voice. Heather laughed bitterly, tears burning in her eyes. Oh, now you care what people think. Years of pain poured out uncontrollably after being buried for far too long. You're selfish, cruel, manipulative. Heather.
No.
Her voice cracked violently. You're just a spoiled, heartless blonde bitch who thinks being pretty excuses everything. The entire camp froze. Even the wind through the trees seemed to stop. Lindsay's expression finally changed. Not anger. Something deeper. Something wounded. Heather realized immediately how ugly the words sounded the moment they left her mouth. But she was too hurt to stop now. Too broken. I spent my whole life feeling unwanted, Heather whispered shakily, tears finally slipping down her face. And for one stupid second, I thought maybe somebody finally chose me. Silence swallowed the camp whole.
No sarcasm.
No challenge announcements.
No laughter.
Just painful honesty hanging in the air between them. Lindsay looked away first. When Heather finally walked toward the dock of shame later that evening, the island felt quieter somehow. Owen hugged her tightly before she boarded the boat. You're actually really nice, he mumbled sadly. Bridget squeezed Heather's hand gently. Courtney offered her a respectful nod. Even Duncan muttered a quiet, tough break. Heather thanked each of them softly. But when she stopped in front of Lindsay, the silence between them became unbearable. For a brief moment, it looked like Lindsay wanted to say something. Anything. An apology. An explanation. A reason. But pride held her still. Heather stuttered her one final time. Not angry anymore. Just disappointed. Then she walked past her without another word. The boat slowly disappeared into the darkness beyond the lake. And standing alone on the dock beneath the cold night wind, Lindsay finally felt something she had spent the entire season avoiding. Alone. The island always felt strange after dark, but tonight was different. The forest surrounding the cabin seemed heavier somehow, the trees bending and creaking in the wind like crooked silhouettes watching from the edge of the camp. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, twisting together whenever lightning flashed across the sky. Even the lake had gone unnervingly still, its dark surface reflecting nothing beneath the storm clouds overhead. It felt like the entire island was holding its breath. Standing in the center of the clearing, Chris McLean wore a cheap hockey mask and revved a rubber chainsaw with theatrical enthusiasm. The sound echoed through the camp loud enough to make several contestants jump immediately. Naturally, Owen screamed first. Chris lifted the mask just enough for his grin to show. Welcome, campers, to tonight's challenge: hook, line and screamer. A massive bolt of lightning exploded across the sky behind him with perfect timing. Everyone slowly turned toward Chef. Chef casually lowered a control switch. The rules are simple, Chris continued cheerfully, pacing in front of the group like a game show host announcing vacation prizes instead of psychological warfare. You survive a night in a horror movie scenario. Last camper standing wins immunity. Bridget folded her arms uneasily, trying not to look bothered by the atmosphere around them. Okay, but this is fake, right? Chris' smile widened in a way that immediately made the question worse. No comment. Silence settled over the campers. And somehow, that answer terrified them far more than if he had simply said yes. Only 7 contestants remained now. Lindsay, Duncan, Courtney, Jeff, Bridget, Owen, Dee. Without Heather or Gwen around anymore, the camp no longer had the same emotional structure holding it together. Gwen had been the quiet center that balanced the louder personalities, while Heather's constant manipulation had forced everyone to stay alert and united against her. Now both were gone. The atmosphere felt emptier, unstable, like a table missing too many legs but somehow still standing. For the first time all season, Lindsay no longer had Heather beside her. Even when Heather insulted her, controlled her, or used her as a pawn, there had always been a strange consistency to their partnership. Heather gave direction. Lindsay followed it. Simple, predictable. But now Lindsay stood alone beneath the flickering camp lights, staring out at the dark forest with unease written clearly across her face. And for the first time since arriving on the island, she looked genuinely afraid. Most of the contestants assumed the killer stalking the camp was fake. Scripted. Another one of Chris' ridiculous stunts. But Lindsay could not fully convince herself of that. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the isolation. Or maybe it was because people who spent their lives controlling appearances understood fear differently than everyone else. Lindsay knew how quickly situations could spiral once control disappeared. Beneath all the vanity and manipulation, there was always that deeper panic lurking underneath. The terror of not knowing what happened next. The fake killer appeared for the first time near the cabins. A massive figure emerged between the trees, dragging a metal hook across the wooden walls, producing a long screeching sound that sliced through the night air like nails against bone. Owen fainted instantly. Bridget yelped and stumbled backward. DJ nearly climbed onto the cabin roof. But Lindsay simply froze. Her eyes remained locked on the dark figure standing near the trees. "That's not a contestant," she whispered quietly. Duncan snorted beside her, arms crossed lazily. "Relax, Barbier. It's obviously Chef." "No," Lindsay said sharply, her voice tighter than usual. "What if it isn't?" The seriousness in her tone caught everyone off guard. For once, nobody laughed at her, because the island itself felt wrong. Too quiet. Too convincing. Too real. As the challenge continued, Chris and Chef suddenly vanished without explanation, leaving the contestants completely alone in the middle of the storm. Panic spread almost immediately. Courtney stepped forward before anyone else could spiral completely out of control. "Okay," she said firmly, forcing confidence into her voice even as thunder rattled the camp around them. "Nobody separates. We stay together, we stay indoors, and we secure every entrance." Duncan leaned casually against the mess hall wall with an amused grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've been waiting all season to say that." Courtney ignored him completely. "We need supplies, defensive tools, and lookout positions." Jeff blinked. "You sound weirdly prepared for murder." Courtney pointed aggressively toward the kitchen, because horror movies punish stupid people. Honestly, nobody could argue with that logic. The group quickly barricaded themselves inside the mess hall while wind hammered violently against the windows outside. Chairs scraped across the floor as they blocked doors. Cabinets were pushed against entrances. Every loud noise from outside made someone jump. For a little while, it almost felt safe. Almost. As the hours dragged on, Courtney worked relentlessly to keep everyone organized while fear slowly infected the room. DJ flinched every time the lights flickered overhead. Owen Stress ate an entire emergency loaf of bread while muttering prayers under his breath. Bridget kept trying to reassure everyone, though her nervous smile convinced absolutely nobody. Meanwhile, Duncan looked like he was enjoying himself far too much. "You seriously think this is fun?" Courtney whispered incredulously after Duncan laughed through another fake jump scare. Duncan shrugged lazily. I grew up watching horror movies. This is basically date night. Courtney rolled her eyes so hard it physically hurt. But despite herself, she smiled. The expression disappeared instantly when a metal hook smashed violently through the window beside them. Glass exploded across the floor. Everyone screamed. Even Duncan flinched this time. The killer began picking them off one by one. Jeff disappeared first after insisting he heard movement outside near the dock. One moment he was there joking about bravery, and the next the darkness swallowed him whole. Bridget vanished shortly afterward near the lake. Owen attempted to hide inside a flour container in the pantry and was dragged out kicking and screaming loud enough for the entire island to hear him. Each disappearance tightened the tension inside the remaining group. And with every new scare, Lindsay unraveled a little more. She stopped insulting people. Stopped making sarcastic comments. Stopped pretending she was above everything happening around her. Fear stripped away her carefully maintained control piece by piece until all that remained was raw anxiety. At one point, after hearing footsteps echo down a nearby hallway, Lindsay instinctively grabbed Courtney's arm tightly. Courtney looked down at her in surprise. Lindsay immediately pulled away, embarrassed by her own reaction. Neither of them mentioned it afterward. Eventually, only 4 contestants remained. Lindsay, Duncan, Courtney. The 4 of them hid together inside the kitchen while thunder shook the building overhead hard enough to rattle the hanging cookware. DJ sat beneath a table clutching a frying pan against his chest like it was military protection. I can't do this, he whispered shakily. Courtney crouched beside him, trying to sound calm despite the fear tightening inside her own chest. It's not real. DJ looked at her with absolute desperation. What if it is? Duncan attempted to help in his own uniquely terrible way. Bro, if the killer wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. DJ stared at him in horror. That doesn't help. Before anyone could respond, the lights suddenly died. Darkness swallowed the kitchen completely. A loud crash echoed somewhere nearby. DJ screamed louder than anyone else in the building. Then the killer stepped slowly out of the darkness. This time, DJ barely reacted at all. His body had reached total emotional shutdown. The masked figure simply pointed directly at him. Chris' voice echoed dramatically through hidden speakers overhead. DJ has officially lost the challenge due to maximum terror levels. DJ looked seconds away from crying with relief. Thank you. He practically sprinted towards safety before Chris even finished speaking. That left only Duncan and Courtney. And somehow, despite their completely opposite personalities, they functioned together perfectly under pressure.
Duncan handled immediate danger instinctively.
He reacted fast, aggressive and fearless were never threatened. Courtney handled strategy, movement, planning. Where Duncan charged forward recklessly, Courtney directed the chaos into something useful. The combination should have collapsed instantly. Instead, it worked frighteningly well. When the killer cornered them inside the lodge hallway, Duncan grabbed a chair and swung without hesitation. Courtney followed immediately behind him, smashing a fire extinguisher into the attacker's ribs with brutal force. The fake killer stumbled backward hard enough to crash through a nearby table. Duncan's grin widened wildly. Oh, this is awesome. Courtney's breathing had become sharp now, adrenaline surging fully through her system. That same fierce competitive intensity she had shown during earlier challenges burned behind her eyes again. Again, she shouted. Together they charged the killer instead of running. Not surviving. Fighting back. The attacker collapsed beneath the combined assault. Then another figure appeared behind them. Larger. Silent. Holding a real chainsaw. Every ounce of energy vanished from the room instantly. Even Duncan froze. For one horrifying second, nobody moved. Then Duncan grabbed Courtney's wrist hard enough to yank her backward. Run. The chase through the lodge became absolute chaos. Furniture shattered beneath the killer's attacks. Doors slammed open and splintered apart. Rain blasted through broken windows as lightning illuminated the lodge in violent flashes of white. But through all of it, Duncan and Courtney never separated once. Neither abandoned the other. Not even for a second. Finally, inside the kitchen, Duncan tackled the killer directly while Courtney grabbed the nearest heavy metal pot and smashed it across the attacker's head with shocking force. The killer collapsed unconscious onto the floor. Silence filled the room. Then Chris suddenly emerged from behind the pantry clapping enthusiastically like he had just watched a stage performance. Amazing performance, campers. Courtney turned toward him slowly, eyes twitching with disbelief. You knew there were 2 killers. Chris shrugged carelessly. Ratings. By the end of the challenge, DJ's terror level remained unmatched by anyone else. Chris eliminated him almost immediately. DJ did not even attempt to argue. I miss my mama. As DJ boarded the boat of losers and disappeared into the foggy darkness surrounding the island, the remaining contestants stood silently along the dock watching him leave. For the first time all season, something had become painfully obvious. Duncan and Courtney together were dangerous. Not just strategically. Emotionally. They balanced each other in ways that made both of them stronger, sharper, and far harder to break. And Lindsay noticed it immediately. As the boat vanished into the fog, she stood alone beneath the dim camp lights thinking the exact same thing Heather once had. They might be the biggest threat left in this game. Morning crept over Camp Wawanakwa beneath a blanket of grey clouds and heavy mist. Damp air clung to the island like a wet sheet, carrying the smell of mud, pine, and lake water through the cabins. Somewhere deep in the trees, birds screeched loud enough to sound almost violent, while distant rustling branches hinted that the island's wildlife had already started its day long before the campers had. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Chris McLean had started his day too. And whenever Chris sounded this cheerful that early in the morning, suffering usually followed. The remaining campers dragged themselves toward the dock in varying states of exhaustion after the previous night's horror challenge. Duncan looked like he had slept maybe 2 hours at most, dark circles resting beneath his eyes as he shoved his hands into his pockets with practiced indifference. Owen sat cross-legged near the edge of the dock, eating dry cereal straight from the box while occasionally dropping pieces into the lake. Bridget leaned sleepily against Jeff's shoulder, barely awake, while Courtney stood a few feet away studying the challenge board with the focus of someone preparing for military deployment rather than a summer camp competition. A short distance behind them stood Lindsay. Not excluded physically. Nobody had told her to leave. Nobody had pushed her away. But the separation still existed all the same. Ever since Heather's elimination, the social gap between Lindsay and the others had become impossible to ignore. The smiles she wore still looked beautiful. Her charm still worked on instinct. Her appearance still turned heads whenever she walked into view. But trust had vanished completely. The others spoke around her now instead of to her. Conversations paused when she approached. Smiles became guarded. Even casual interactions carried invisible tension beneath them. The damage she created had not. Chris stepped forward with an enormous grin stretched across his face, clearly thrilled by whatever nightmare he had prepared. Campers, he announced dramatically. Today's challenge is Wawanakwa Gone Wild. Chef rolled several rusty animal cages onto the dock with enough force to make everyone flinch. You'll each be assigned a specific animal hidden somewhere on this island, Chris continued. Your job is to capture it and bring it back safely. Owen slowly lowered his cereal box. Safely for us or safely for the animal? Chris ignored him completely. Some of the animals are harmless, he said casually. Some are dangerous. Some are horrifying. Honestly, production stopped checking after the lawsuits. Owen raised his hand nervously. Can we get rabies from this challenge? Yes, Chef answered immediately. Owen nodded once. Cool. The campers groaned as Chris began handing out assignment cards one by one. Most of them reacted with mild annoyance. Then Lindsay received hers. Chris barely managed to contain his laughter as he handed over the card. Capture one adult black bear. For several seconds, Lindsay simply stared at him. You're joking. Chris grinned wider. Nope. Duncan snorted under his breath while Owen visibly backed away from her. That feels illegal, Bridget muttered. Probably is, Duncan replied. Within minutes, the contestants scattered across the island in search of their assigned animals. Some adapted quickly. Others absolutely did not. Jeff and Bridget naturally ended up working side by side despite technically competing separately. Their teamwork came easily now, built from weeks of trust and shared experience. Even when distractions slowed them down, usually because Jeff got sidetracked trying to impress Bridget, they still managed to make steady progress through the forest. Owen somehow stumbled his way through the challenge almost entirely through luck and food accidents. At one point, his assigned raccoon climbed willingly into his cage after discovering half a peanut butter sandwich inside. Duncan approached the challenge like a hunt. Calm, focused, efficient. He moved through the woods with quiet confidence, tracking movement through broken branches and disturbed dirt like he had done this his entire life. Courtney, meanwhile, had become something far more dangerous than anyone realized. Without Harold sabotaging her earlier in the season, She had continued evolving throughout the competition. The emotional outbursts that once defined her had slowly faded away, replaced by control and discipline. She no longer wasted energy screaming every time things went wrong. Now she adapted, planned, calculated, and during this challenge, she thrived. Mud stained her clothes as she pushed through thick brush without hesitation. Branches scratched against her arms while she tracked her assigned animal deeper into the forest with terrifying determination. Every obstacle only sharpened her focus further. When she spotted a raccoon wandering loose through the undergrowth, Courtney paused briefly. A slow smile crossed her face. "Opportunity is opportunity," she murmured. By late afternoon, Courtney returned to camp dragging not one cage behind her, but two. Chris nearly looked emotional. Now that's commitment to unhealthy levels of competitiveness. Duncan let out a low whistle as Courtney dropped the cages onto the dock. "You scare me a little." Courtney brushed dirt from her arms with clear satisfaction glowing behind her eyes. "You should." And strangely enough, Duncan looked genuinely impressed by the answer. Far deeper in the forest, Lindsay's situation had deteriorated into complete disaster. At first, she attempted confidence. That failed. Then manipulation. That somehow failed harder. Afterward, she tried bribery, which only resulted in a bear sniffing her backpack before nearly charging her into a tree. 2 exhausting hours later, Lindsay sat slumped against a fallen log covered in dirt, sweat, and leaves. Her hair had partially fallen apart, mascara lightly smeared beneath one eye from stress and humidity. Across from her, somewhere beyond the trees, the black bear growled softly. Lindsay glared toward the sound. "Stop judging me." The bear growled again. "This is humiliating." Every strategy collapsed almost immediately. Her traps failed. Her bait failed. At one point, she had actually attempted to lure the animal using expensive cosmetics from her emergency makeup bag. Shockingly, the bear had not cared about premium skincare products. If anything, it looked offended. Frustration built steadily inside her chest until eventually another thought surfaced against her will. Heather would have figured this out. The realization irritated her instantly. Heather would have stayed calm. Heather would have manipulated somebody else into helping. Heather would have had a plan. "No," Lindsay snapped aloud, rising suddenly from the log. "I don't need her." But the words sounded weaker than she wanted them to, because deep down, she no longer fully believed them herself. Eventually, desperation pushed Lindsay towards something almost unthinkable. She asked someone for help. The first attempt came when she found Jeff near the river carrying his completed cage. "Hey," Lindsay said carefully, forcing politeness into her voice. "Can you help distract the bear for a minute?" Jeff hesitated immediately. Not angry, just uncomfortable. "I kinda already finished my challenge." Lindsay crossed her arms. "So?" Jeff rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "So, I don't really trust you." The answer hit harder than expected. Not because it surprised her, because it didn't. Bridget refused too, though far more gently. "Sorry, Lindsay." Even Owen nervously backed away when she approached him near the cabins. "I don't want to get manipulated and eaten today." Each rejection chipped slowly at the confidence Lindsay usually carried so effortlessly. For the first time in weeks, the consequences of everything she and Heather had done became unavoidable. People remembered betrayal. And Lindsay had given them plenty to remember. As sunset painted the island orange and gold, Duncan eventually found her still wandering the woods alone. The bear remained uncaptured. "You're seriously still doing this?" he asked. Lindsay immediately folded her arms defensively. "I had a strategy." Duncan glanced around the destroyed campsite nearby. "You mean panic?" She shot him an irritated glare. For a brief moment, Duncan genuinely considered helping her. Not out of kindness. Strategically, keeping Lindsay in the game made perfect sense. Everyone already distrusted her. Nobody respected her socially anymore. If she reached the final rounds, she would absorb votes and attention away from stronger competitors. She was the ideal shield. But helping her openly would create problems with Jeff, Bridget, and Owen. Duncan had spent too long building solid alliances to damage them now over someone already isolated. The risk outweighed the reward. So eventually he shrugged. "Good luck with the bear." Then he turned and walked away through the trees without another word. Lindsay watched him disappear into the fading sunlight. And for the first time since arriving on the island, she truly understood what isolation felt like. Back at camp, Chris proudly announced Courtney's reward for winning the challenge: a private dinner with Duncan beside the lake. Chef had clearly attempted romance against his will. Candles flickered across the table. Music played softly from hidden speakers somewhere near the dock. The entire setup looked like a low-budget reality dating show produced by people who hated happiness. Unfortunately, Owen destroyed the atmosphere almost immediately. While sprinting across camp chasing his escaped animal, he crashed directly into the dinner table at full speed. Everything exploded. Plates shattered across the dock. Soup drenched Duncan completely. Pasta slid dramatically down Courtney's sleeve before splattering onto the floor. Owen froze in horror. "I can explain." Duncan slowly wiped soup from his face. "You really can't." Courtney stared silently at the ruined table for several long seconds while visible rage flickered behind her eyes. Then she inhaled once, exhaled slowly, and somehow stayed calm, which honestly frightened everyone more. Despite the disaster, Duncan and Courtney still spent the evening together while the others cleaned up the mess. Eventually, their conversation shifted away from jokes and towards something far more important: strategy. Inside the mess hall, their voices remained low but serious. At first, Jeff and Bridget assumed they were flirting. Then they realized they were planning. "Lindsay should go next," Courtney said firmly. "She's manipulative, socially dangerous, and unpredictable." Duncan leaned back casually in his chair. "True, but everyone already hates her." Courtney frowned slightly. And that makes her useful." Understanding slowly crossed Courtney's face. "If she reaches Final Five," Duncan continued calmly, "nobody votes for her in the finale. She's basically a guaranteed shield." Courtney hated how logical that sounded. Because strategically? He was right. Duncan drummed his fingers lightly against the table. "What about Izzy?" Courtney immediately sighed. "She's impossible to predict." Exactly. Izzy was chaos disguised as a contestant. She wasn't isolated socially. She wasn't hated enough to target naturally. And worst of all, she operated completely outside normal strategy. That made her dangerous. "She's a wildcard," Courtney admitted quietly. "And wildcard players get worse the longer they survive." By the end of the discussion, they reached a decision. Lindsay could wait. Izzy couldn't. Night settled heavily over the campfire ceremony as the remaining contestants took their seats beneath the dark sky. Firelight flickered across nervous faces while the lake behind them reflected pale moonlight through the mist. Izzy sat upside down on her log, humming happily to herself. Lindsay looked exhausted despite trying desperately not to show it. Courtney sat perfectly composed. Duncan looked relaxed. Chris stepped forward holding the tray of marshmallows with theatrical excitement. "Courtney." She caught her marshmallow calmly. "Duncan." "Jeff." "Bridget." "Owen." Only 2 contestants remained beside the fire. Izzy grinned wildly. Lindsay stared straight ahead without blinking. Chris dragged out the silence with obvious enjoyment. "And the final marshmallow goes to..." A smirk spread slowly across his face. "Lindsay." Izzy gasped dramatically before jumping to her feet. "Yes. I love boats." Nobody had expected that reaction. Not even Chris. As Chef escorted her toward the dock of shame, Izzy spun around one final time beneath the moonlight. "You people are boring now." Then she saluted a nearby squirrel with complete sincerity before disappearing into the darkness. Silence settled over the camp as the boat drifted away across the lake. One by one, the remaining contestants slowly turned their attention toward Lindsay. Still here. Still dangerous. And now more alone than ever before. The island itself hadn't changed, but the atmosphere had. The laughter outside the cabins no longer echoed across the campgrounds the way it used to, and conversations rarely lasted long before dropping into suspicious whispers. Everyone watched everyone now. Every smile carried caution behind it. Every alliance felt temporary. With Lindsay still in the game, nobody truly relaxed anymore. Not completely. Even Owen, who usually treated danger like an optional side quest, had started glancing over his shoulder whenever footsteps approached behind him. A cold layer of morning fog rolled across the lake as Chris gathered the remaining campers near the dock. The water behind him looked grey and endless beneath the cloudy sky, while the old wooden planks creaked beneath the weight of the contestants. Only 6 campers remained. Courtney, Duncan, Bridget, Jeff, Owen, Lindsay. Chris spread his arms dramatically toward the lake as though presenting the world's greatest spectacle. "Welcome, campers, to today's challenge, trial by tree-arm triathlon. Before anyone could react, Chef lifted an air horn and blasted it directly beside Owen's head. Owen screamed loud enough to startle birds from the nearby trees. Chris nearly doubled over laughing. You'll be competing in randomly assigned teams through 3 brutal stages of pain, suffering, and potential emotional damage. Teamwork, endurance, and trust will determine who survives. Duncan snorted quietly and folded his arms. Trust, he muttered. That's hilarious. Nobody argued with him. The silence itself was agreement. Round 1, the pairings. Chris reached into a rusted metal bucket and dramatically pulled out the team assignments. Owen and Courtney. Courtney looked personally insulted by reality itself. Owen, meanwhile, lit up immediately. Yes, team friendship. We are absolutely not calling it that, Courtney said without hesitation. Chris ignored them and continued. Bridget and Duncan. The two exchanged awkward glances almost immediately. At first glance, they had almost nothing in common. Bridget was calm, compassionate, and emotionally honest in a way that made people naturally trust her. Duncan operated on sarcasm, rebellion, and years of carefully maintained emotional distance. Yet beneath all of that, there were similarities neither of them openly acknowledged. Both were fiercely loyal once someone earned their trust. Both protected the people they cared about without hesitation. And both had quietly become tired of the manipulation poisoning the game. That fragile common ground was enough to keep them functional. Barely. And finally, Chris announced with obvious delight, Jeff and Lindsay. At first glance, they looked like a surprisingly solid team. Both attractive. Both charismatic. Both socially gifted. The kind of pair that should have dominated effortlessly. But the tension between them appeared almost immediately, sharp and invisible beneath their smiles. Because Jeff had started noticing things lately. Things he could no longer ignore. Stage 1. Mountain Climb Madness. The first challenge began at the base of a massive muddy hill that stretched upward like a nightmare. The incline was steep, slick with rainwater, and covered in roots and loose stones. To make matters worse, each pair had been chained together at the wrist. Chef fired a flare gun into the air. The race began instantly. Courtney took control within seconds. Owen, shorter steps, she ordered while climbing aggressively upward. Match my pace and stop yanking the chain. I'm trying. Owen wheezed dramatically as his foot slipped in the mud. This mountain is attacking me. Courtney looked down in horror. Are you eating right now? Owen held up a partially crushed burrito. It's a stress burrito. Despite the constant arguing, the two somehow worked absurdly well together. Courtney's relentless focus balanced out Owen's raw stamina surprisingly effectively. Every time she slipped, Owen's weight kept her upright. Every time Owen lost momentum, Courtney dragged him forward through sheer force of will. By the time they reached the summit first, even Chris looked genuinely impressed. First place goes to Courtney and Owen. Courtney allowed herself exactly one satisfied smile before immediately fixing Owen's posture again. You're breathing wrong. I didn't know breathing had rules. Everything has rules. Bridget and Duncan. Further behind them, Bridget and Duncan slowly developed a rhythm of their own. Not a graceful rhythm. Not even a friendly one. But functional. Left, Bridget warned while ducking beneath a branch. I know what left is. You walked directly into a tree 10 seconds ago. That tree moved. Bridget laughed despite herself. Duncan rolled his eyes, but the corner of his mouth twitched slightly upward. Their personalities clashed constantly throughout the climb, yet unlike Lindsay, Duncan never hid behind fake charm or manipulation. If he was annoyed, he said it openly. If he disagreed, he argued honestly. Bridget respected that more than she expected. Meanwhile, Duncan quietly realized something about Bridget too. She never panicked. Even when she slipped waist-deep into mud or nearly lost her footing near a steep drop, she stayed calm and adapted immediately. There was a quiet toughness beneath her kindness that Duncan found unexpectedly real. They reached the summit exhausted, filthy, and breathing heavily. Second place. Solid. Reliable. Unexpectedly effective. Jeff and Lindsay begin to crack. At first Jeff tried keeping things casual. Come on, he said while climbing. We've got this. Obviously, Lindsay replied with a confident smile. But the higher they climbed, the more the cracks began to show. Jeff noticed how quickly Lindsay blamed other people whenever mistakes happened. He noticed how her cheerful personality faded whenever the cameras drifted away from her. Most importantly, he noticed how nobody trusted her anymore. Not really. And eventually, the question that had been sitting in the back of everyone's mind finally came out. Why did you kiss Trent? Lindsay stiffened. What? You heard me. The chain between them rattled softly as they continued climbing through the mud. Jeff spoke carefully now, no longer joking. Was it strategy? Revenge? Were you just trying to upset Gwen? Lindsay avoided looking at him. It worked, didn't it? Jeff frowned immediately. That's not an answer. Something colder entered his expression then. And what you did to Heather and Beth wasn't cool either. Lindsay's jaw tightened hard enough to hurt. Then Jeff said the one thing he absolutely should not have said. You're kinda not who people thought you were. That hurt. But the next sentence hurt far worse. You're not even popular anymore. The word slammed into Lindsay harder than any elimination threat ever had. Because popularity was never just vanity to her. It was identity, validation, control. Being admired meant safety. Being wanted meant power. Without that attention, without people liking her, she suddenly had no idea who she was supposed to be anymore. Her expression darkened almost instantly. For the first time all challenge, Jeff finally saw the real person underneath the performance. Not the smiling blonde girl who charmed rooms effortlessly. Not the manipulator hiding behind sweetness. Someone angry. Someone deeply insecure. You think popularity matters? She snapped defensively. You act like it does. The argument escalated so badly that they nearly lost the challenge completely. They only survived because another team got trapped in mud even longer. Neither of them celebrated afterward. Stage 3, total collapse. The final stage involved crossing dangerous rapids on unstable wooden rafts. The river churned violently beneath the grey sky, smashing waves against jagged rocks while cold water sprayed across the contestants. The rafts barely looked safe enough to float, let alone survive the current. By this point, Jeff and Lindsay could barely tolerate each other. Every instruction became an argument. Paddle left. I am paddling left. Your other left. How is this somehow my fault? Meanwhile, Bridget and Duncan performed far better than expected. They weren't elegant, but they communicated honestly and adapted quickly whenever problems appeared. Courtney continued dragging Owen toward competence through pure intimidation. And somehow, against all odds, Bridget and Duncan won the entire triathlon. Chris blew an air horn again as the two collapsed onto the shore, soaked and exhausted. Bridget and Duncan are safe. Immunity. Safety. One less thing to fear tonight. Which meant everyone else was vulnerable. And Lindsay immediately understood exactly how dangerous that was. Lindsay starts scrambling. The second the campers returned to camp, strategy conversations exploded across the island. Jeff was social, athletic, and universally liked. That made him dangerous. Lindsay knew she needed him gone before the finale. She found Owen sitting near the dock with an enormous plate of cookies balanced on his lap. Hey, Owen, she said sweetly while sitting beside him. Owen hesitated slightly. He knew what she was now. Everyone did. Still, his eyes narrowed suspiciously toward the cookies. Did you make these? Lindsay smiled innocently. Maybe. 5 minutes later, Owen was nodding along while eating his 6th cookie. You know, he admitted between bites, Jeff is really strong. Hooked. Lindsay approached Courtney next. Unfortunately for her, Courtney saw the manipulation coming immediately. No, Courtney said before Lindsay even opened her mouth. You don't even know what I was gonna say. I absolutely do. Lindsay crossed her arms. Jeff's a bigger threat than me. Courtney didn't answer immediately, which meant the statement landed. Lindsay noticed the hesitation instantly and leaned slightly closer. He and Bridget are basically inseparable now. Courtney's expression shifted almost invisibly. Tiny, but noticeable. Because despite everything else happening in the game, she had quietly started worrying about how close Duncan and Jeff had become too. Strong friendships this late in the competition were dangerous. Lindsay saw the doubt forming in real time, and smiled slightly. Not victory. Opportunity. That night, tension wrapped around the campfire like smoke. Nobody spoke much while Chris held the marshmallows dramatically over the flames. First marshmallow goes to Jeff. Jeff caught it calmly. Next one, Lindsay. Lindsay grabbed hers without expression. Chris continued, dragging the moment out painfully. Jeff. Lindsay. Jeff. Lindsay. Silence.
Tia.
Everyone froze. Chris grinned like a man who had just discovered happiness itself. Oh, I love drama. Chef rolled 2 tiny boats onto the dock alongside flaming torches. Tiebreaker challenge, Chris announced excitedly. Race across the lake carrying fire. First camper to light the signal post stays in the game. The race began immediately. At first Jeff dominated completely. Of course he did. The lake was practically part of his soul at this point. The others immediately began shouting encouragement from the shore. Go Jeff. You got this. Even Bridget looked hopeful again. Meanwhile, Lindsay rode furiously behind him, panic slowly breaking through the mask she had worn all season. If she lost now, it was over.
No alliances.
No influence. No control. Nothing. Then suddenly, her boat flipped violently sideways. Help! Jeff turned instantly. For one brief moment, he hesitated. Then he groaned under his breath and turned back toward her. Because despite everything Lindsay had done, Jeff was still Jeff. The second he got close enough, Lindsay kicked him hard directly in the chest. Jeff crashed backward into the freezing water. The entire shoreline gasped. Lindsay surged toward the dock with the torch clenched tightly in her hand. Jeff recovered quickly and swam after her, grabbing the edge of the platform just as she reached the signal post. Then Lindsay stomped directly onto his hand. Hard. Jeff winced sharply and stared up at her in disbelief. Dude, he said angrily. You are seriously not cool. Lindsay's breathing had become ragged now, her composure finally collapsing completely. You know what? Jeff snapped. Heather was right about you. Something inside Lindsay finally broke. I am sweet, she shouted suddenly. People loved me back home. I was the most popular girl in school. Teachers liked me even when I failed classes. Her voice cracked with genuine desperation. You all hate me just because I actually play the game. One day you're gonna meet someone worse than me. Thunder rumbled violently above the lake. Lindsay raised the torch, fury and humiliation twisting together across her face. For one dangerous second, it genuinely looked like she might shove Jeff back into the water entirely. Then lightning struck the signal post. The explosion of sparks lit the dock white. Lindsay screamed as flames caught her hair instantly. Panic replaced anger immediately. She dove headfirst into the lake to extinguish the fire. And in that single moment, Jeff pulled himself upward, grabbed the fallen torch, and lit the signal fire. Victory. Silence settled over the dock afterward. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Lindsay slowly climbed out of the lake, drenched from head to toe. Part of her hair had burned away unevenly, while mascara streaked down her face in dark lines. For the first time all season, she didn't look glamorous or intimidating. She just looked exhausted. Chris smirked dramatically. Well, guess that means Lindsay is eliminated. Nobody celebrated very loudly. Not even Jeff. Because despite everything she had done, watching someone completely fall apart like that felt strangely awful. Lindsay covered her face with both hands as she walked toward the boat of losers. Partly from humiliation. Partly because she didn't want anyone seeing her cry. Before stepping aboard, she paused briefly beside the others. Her eyes met Courtney's first, then Duncan's, then finally drifted toward Heather's now empty seat near the campfire. For one brief second, regret flickered across her expression. Real regret. Then the moment disappeared behind her usual mask. The boat slowly drifted away into the darkness. And for the first time in weeks, Camp Wawanakwa finally felt lighter again. For the first time in weeks, the campers no longer walked around like they were waiting for a knife to slip between their ribs. The tension that had infected every conversation finally began to loosen its grip on the island. Breakfasts became quieter in a peaceful way instead of an uncomfortable one. People laughed more easily around the campfire, and even the cabins felt lighter without Lindsay constantly whispering in someone's ear while tearing somebody else apart behind a polished smile. But even with her gone, the damage she left behind refused to disappear so easily. Some wounds lingered long after the person who caused them had already left. Gwen still carried the humiliation and heartbreak from the diary incident. Heather carried the guilt of allowing everything to happen for so long. And across Canada, millions of viewers sat glued to their televisions as the truth behind the season slowly unraveled piece by piece. The afternoon sky burned orange above the lake as Chris McLean stood dramatically at the end of the dock, arms spread wide before the eliminated contestants who had returned for the special challenge. "Welcome, former losers, to Oat Camp Tour," Chris announced proudly, his grin widening beneath the camera lights. "Today, you'll decide who has become America's, well, technically Canada's, favorite campers, and who has become reality television poison." Chef rolled out massive racks of bizarre clothing beside him. Feather boas, neon ski suits, fake royal capes, and outfits that looked stolen from discount science fiction movies rattled across the wooden dock while production assistants scrambled around with cameras. At first glance, it looked ridiculous. But everyone understood what this challenge truly was. This was not about fashion. It was about reputation. And reputations could destroy people far more effectively than any elimination ceremony ever could. One of the biggest differences this season came from a single important detail. The cameras had caught everything. Unlike before, misunderstandings had not survived for weeks without answers. The footage existed in full, and now the producers were more than happy to air every painful second of it. Massive outdoor screens flickered to life near the campfire while the contestants gathered together uneasily. Then the footage began. The audience watched Lindsay secretly plant Gwen's diary. They watched her intentionally kiss Trent solely to emotionally sabotage Gwen. They watched Heather hesitate repeatedly during Lindsay's manipulations, clearly uncomfortable despite continuing to follow along. And finally, the footage revealed the truth that changed everything. Cody had been innocent. The moment his recorded confession played across the screen, the atmosphere around the camp shifted immediately. "I didn't mean for Gwen to get hurt." Cody's own nervous voice echoed through the speakers while the footage showed him holding the diary uncertainly. "I thought somebody wanted me to find it." Then came the clips of Lindsay carefully setting the entire situation into motion behind the scenes. Silence spread across the dock. Tyler blinked slowly in disbelief. "Whoa." Beth covered her mouth with both hands while Owen grimaced uncomfortably. Even Duncan, who rarely looked genuinely disturbed by anything, muttered under his breath, "Okay, that's actually messed up." Cody sat frozen near the back of the group while the footage continued replaying. For weeks, people had viewed him as the creep who exposed Gwen's private thoughts to the entire camp. Now everyone understood the truth. He had been manipulated too. And almost overnight, the hatred aimed at him finally disappeared. The biggest emotional shift, however, happened between Gwen and Trent. Without Lindsay remaining in the game to continue poisoning every interaction between them, the distance separating the two finally began to shrink naturally. That evening, while the others prepared ridiculous outfits for the challenge, Gwen and Trent sat quietly near the edge of the dock with their feet hanging above the water. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The lake moved gently beneath them while the sounds of distant laughter echoed from the camp behind. Eventually Trent exhaled quietly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I should have talked to you sooner." Gwen kept her eyes lowered toward the water below them. "I should have trusted you more." There was no yelling.
No dramatic explosión.
No desperate attempt to force emotions into a bigger moment than they needed to be. Just honesty. Two exhausted people finally realizing how badly they had both been manipulated from the very beginning. And unlike before, there was no confusion clouding things anymore. The truth now existed openly for everyone to see. Trent glanced toward her carefully before smiling. "So, are we okay?" Gwen's lips curled into a faint smirk. "We are getting there." It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time since everything fell apart, the two of them genuinely looked happy sitting beside each other again. Not everyone accepted the truth so easily. Tyler remained stubbornly loyal to Lindsay despite the overwhelming evidence against her, and honestly, it frustrated almost everyone left in the game. "You seriously still like her?" Jeff asked, staring at him like he had lost his mind. Tyler crossed his arms immediately. "She's my girlfriend." "Bro," Owen said carefully, trying to sound gentle, "she literally kicked somebody into shark-infested water." Tyler pointed defensively across the dock. That was strategic. Nobody really knew how to respond to that. After a while, most of the campers simply stopped trying to convince him otherwise. Tyler refused to accept the possibility that Lindsay had manipulated him from the beginning. But strangely enough, the thing bothering him most was not even what Lindsay had done. It was hearing people claim that Heather had actually been the emotional backbone of their alliance. "No way," Tyler argued loudly. "Lindsay was obviously the one in charge." The silence afterward felt painful, because now everybody knew the truth. Heather had spent most of the season stabilizing Lindsay emotionally, defending her, calming her down, and quietly cleaning up her messes behind the scenes. Without Heather there to hold things together, Lindsay had spiraled almost immediately. Tyler simply refused to see it. Or maybe he just didn't want to. While the challenge continued around them, Heather spent most of the day looking visibly nervous. Not because of the competition. Because of Beth. Ever since her elimination, Heather had replayed every mistake she made over and over inside her head. Every warning Beth tried to give her. Every opportunity she ignored. Every moment she chose Lindsay over someone who had actually cared about her. Eventually, unable to avoid it any longer, Heather approached Beth near the wardrobe tents where several contestants sorted through ridiculous costume pieces. Beth looked cautious the moment she saw her approaching. Heather stopped a few feet away before taking a slow breath. "I was wrong." Beth blinked in surprise. Heather looked down at her own hands as she spoke. "I kept defending Lindsay because I thought," her voice faltered slightly, "I thought if I stayed loyal long enough, maybe she'd care about me the same way I cared about her." The confession came out quieter than expected, but all it did was ruin our friendship. Beth's expression softened almost immediately. Heather swallowed hard before continuing. "You don't have to trust me again. Honestly, I'd understand if you didn't. I just wanted to say sorry." For a moment, Beth remained silent. Then she sighed. "You were kinda dumb." Heather laughed weakly despite herself, embarrassed tears forming in her eyes. "Yeah. But you're not bad." That nearly shattered what little emotional composure Heather still had left. Beth stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her before Heather could respond. The hug was awkward at first, then real. And just like that, their friendship finally began to heal. Not perfectly, not instantly, but honestly. And that mattered far more. As the challenge carried on, one thing became impossible to ignore. Jeff had become incredibly popular. Not just with the contestants. With the audience too. Honestly, it made complete sense. He had no major enemies inside the game. He constantly supported Bridget, stayed loyal to his friends, and somehow managed to remain genuinely kind even while the competition grew uglier around him. And more importantly than anything else, he had been the one to eliminate Lindsay, the biggest villain of the season. People respected that. Even contestants who barely interacted with Jeff throughout the game found themselves rooting for him now. Chris stood near the cameras reading fan comments aloud dramatically while the campers listened. Then Chris revealed the twist. The eliminated contestants would now vote for who they wanted removed from the game based entirely on popularity, relationships, and overall impact. And suddenly, the mood shifted again. Because this was no longer strategic. This was personal. Courtney remained respected, but many people found her intimidating. Duncan had accumulated enemies throughout the season. Bridget was well liked, though quieter socially. Owen remained beloved but wildly unpredictable. And Jeff was almost universally adored. Ironically, that made him dangerous. As the votes began stacking up, realization slowly spread across the camp. This was happening again. Just like LaShawna before him. Not because people hated him, but because they liked him too much. Katie voted emotionally. Sadie followed immediately after. Several eliminated contestants openly admitted Jeff simply had too many allies and too much social power to risk keeping around. Even Bridget looked stunned while the votes continued piling against him. At first Jeff laughed awkwardly. "Wait, hold on. Seriously?" But eventually the laughter faded, because the numbers kept growing. And finally, Chris smirked toward the stunned surfer. "Jeff, buddy, looks like your popularity just got you eliminated." Unlike many eliminations this season, Jeff's departure didn't feel angry. It just felt sad. Bridget hugged him tightly near the dock before he boarded the boat of losers. "You better call me after this," she whispered against his shoulder. Jeff grinned immediately. "Duh." Even Duncan looked genuinely disappointed as he walked over and held out a fist bump. Later, "Party dude." Jeff returned it instantly. Then he paused beside the boat and looked back toward the island. Toward the cabins. Toward the campfire. Toward the game that suddenly felt far more dangerous without him there. Crazy season, huh? Nobody answered. Because nobody disagreed. The boat slowly drifted away from the dock while the sun disappeared beyond the lake in streaks of orange and gold. And as Jeff vanished into the distance, the remaining contestants sat in heavy silence. Because now everything felt different again. The villains were gone. The alliances were weakening. And every single person left standing suddenly looked capable of winning the entire game. The relationships between them were real now. Weeks of surviving humiliating challenges, sleepless nights, and constant paranoia had worn away most of the fake smiles and temporary partnerships. What remained underneath was genuine attachment. And genuine attachment made betrayal hurt far more deeply. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of cold fog that swallowed most of Camp Wowanakwa whole. Moisture clung to the cabins, the docks, and the dark pine trees surrounding the campgrounds. The island almost looked peaceful in the pale grey light, quiet enough to fool someone unfamiliar with the chaos that normally erupted there. Unfortunately, everyone still alive in the game knew better than to trust peace on this island. Near the mess hall, Chris McLean stood beside a large wooden board with a hand-drawn map nailed crookedly onto it. His smile already carried the dangerous enthusiasm that usually meant somebody's day was about to become miserable. Beside him stood Chef Hatchet, casually holding a tranquilizer gun across his chest like it was the most normal thing imaginable. At this point, nobody even questioned it anymore. Gempersh, Chris announced brightly. Today's challenge is Are We There, Yeti? You'll be trekking through the deepest parts of the island searching for your teammates while avoiding dangerous wildlife, harsh terrain, and Chef. Chef pumped the tranquilizer shotgun with an intimidating click. Owen visibly flinched. Chris's grin widened immediately at the reaction. You'll split into pairs. One player from each pair will be lost in the woods while the other searches for them. Simple enough, right? Duncan folded his arms with a skeptical expression already forming. This sounds stupid already. And unnecessarily expensive, Courtney added dryly. Exactly. Chris replied proudly. The pairings were announced moments later. Duncan with Owen. Courtney with Bridget. The reactions were immediate and completely predictable. Owen threw both fists into the air excitedly. Yes. Dude team. Duncan stared upward like the universe had personally betrayed him. Why is this my life? Nearby, Bridget smiled warmly toward Courtney, already sounding optimistic about their chances. I think we'll work pretty well together. Courtney nodded once, confidence settling naturally into her posture. We will. And honestly, they probably would. Somewhere along the way, Courtney and Bridget had quietly become one of the strongest partnerships left in the competition. They were nothing like the explosive chaos that always followed Duncan and Courtney whenever they interacted. They were nothing like Jeff and Owen's loud, reckless energy either. Instead, they balanced each other. Bridget softened the sharper edges of Courtney's personality, keeping her from alienating everyone around her completely. Meanwhile, Courtney pushed Bridget toward thinking more strategically, forcing her to stop relying entirely on instinct and kindness. Together, they functioned surprisingly well. As the challenge officially began and both teams disappeared into different sections of the forest, Courtney initially felt calm about the situation. She trusted Bridget's reliability, trusted her own planning skills, and trusted that Owen would probably become distracted long before the challenge reached its end. But the deeper they moved into the woods, the more her confidence slowly shifted into something heavier. Awareness. The truth had become impossible to ignore now that the finale was within reach. Duncan was harder to beat than Owen. Far harder. Owen was unpredictable and occasionally lucky, but he lacked focus. Duncan, on the other hand, adapted naturally to pressure. He understood people better than he pretended to. Even when he acted lazy or sarcastic, there was always calculation underneath the surface. Courtney hated admitting that. More frustratingly, a part of her genuinely did not want to eliminate him. That realization irritated her more than anything else. Bridget noticed the distraction almost immediately while climbing over a fallen tree trunk slick with moss. You okay? She asked carefully. Courtney hesitated before answering. Her expression tightened slightly as she stepped over the log beside her. This game would be easier if people weren't people. Bridget laughed softly under her breath. That sounded way more emotional than you probably intended. Courtney groaned quietly in annoyance because Bridget was completely right. Meanwhile, Duncan and Owen were rapidly becoming a disaster combination. Owen stopped every 30 seconds to investigate random noises, plants, or snack-related concerns. Duncan insulted the map constantly despite clearly relying on it. Neither of them wanted to admit they were hopelessly lost. I'm telling you, Duncan muttered while staring around suspiciously, we passed this exact tree already. All trees look the same. Owen argued. Duncan pointed downward immediately. This one has your snack wrapper under it. Owen looked down. Oh. Eventually, After hearing several unsettling noises deeper in the woods, both boys somehow managed to circle back toward areas suspiciously close to camp without openly admitting they were relieved about it. As evening settled over the island, the challenge forced both teams into temporary campsites for the night. Duncan and Owen ended up stranded beside an abandoned ranger cabin that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. The windows were cracked, the roof sagged dangerously, and strange scratching noises occasionally echoed from somewhere inside. Meanwhile, Courtney and Bridget constructed a far more stable shelter near the edge of the lake. Courtney sat beside the fire in silence, staring into the dancing flames while fog rolled softly across the water nearby. Bridget watched her carefully for several moments before finally speaking. "You're thinking about Duncan." Courtney immediately stiffened.
No.
"I'm thinking strategically." Bridget leaned back against a log with a knowing expression. "Same thing right now." The comment annoyed Courtney mostly because it was accurate. After a long pause, Bridget spoke again, quieter this time. "You know it's possible to care about someone and still compete against them." Courtney looked down at the fire, her voice lower than usual when she answered. "That's the problem." For the first time all season, she fully understood what winning might actually cost her. The next morning, the final stage of the challenge began. Chef distributed survival gear with the enthusiasm of someone preparing contestants for military combat, rather than a reality show obstacle course. Each team received basic supplies, including a compass meant to help them navigate back to camp. Unfortunately, Duncan stole Chef's compass almost immediately. Not because he needed it. Simply because he thought it would be funny. "You stole from Chef." Owen whispered in complete horror. Duncan grinned unapologetically while clipping the compass onto his belt. Adds excitement. It absolutely did not. Especially once Chef realized it was missing and began actively hunting them through the woods with terrifying determination. During a brief crossing between teams near a riverbank, Courtney spotted the stolen compass hanging loosely from Duncan's backpack strap. And suddenly, an idea formed in her mind. A ruthless one. For a moment, she genuinely hated herself for even considering it. Then she remembered where they were. Final four. Hesitation lost games. Later that afternoon, Duncan and Owen stopped beside the river while arguing loudly over directions. Owen insisted they should follow the water downstream, while Duncan stubbornly claimed the map clearly suggested the opposite. While their attention stayed focused on each other, Courtney moved quietly behind them. Normally, Duncan would have expected trickery from someone like Heather or Lindsay. He would have watched his back automatically around them. But Courtney, he trusted her enough to let his guard down. That became his mistake. With smooth precision, Courtney unclipped the compass from his belt without making a sound. By the time Duncan noticed the missing weight, Courtney and Bridget were already halfway across the bridge ahead of them. "Courtney!" Duncan shouted incredulously. She glanced back only briefly. "You shouldn't steal from Chef." Even Bridget looked stunned. "You actually robbed Duncan." Courtney kept moving without slowing. "He robbed Chef first." Bridget blinked once before reluctantly nodding. "That's weirdly fair." Duncan stared after Courtney in complete disbelief. Not because she had outplayed him. Because he genuinely had not expected her to do it. And somehow, that hurt worse. The race back toward camp became viciously close after that. Courtney and Bridget navigated efficiently using the compass while Duncan and Owen stumbled through swamps, cliffs, and dense forest with Chef aggressively pursuing them the entire way. Still, Duncan refused to stop fighting. That was the thing about him. No matter how irritated, exhausted, or betrayed he became, he kept moving forward anyway. By the time both teams burst through the tree line near camp, the distance between them was barely seconds apart. Chris stood near the finish line practically vibrating with excitement. This is the closest challenge yet. Courtney sprinted ahead at full speed with Bridget close behind her. Duncan charged forward desperately while Owen crashed through bushes beside him like a runaway animal. For one brief moment, it genuinely looked like either team could win. Then Owen tripped directly into Duncan. Both boys crashed sideways down a muddy hill in a tangle of limbs and shouting. Courtney crossed the finish line first. Bridget crossed immediately after her. Victory. The campfire ceremony that night felt heavier than any before it. Nobody joked much. Nobody relaxed. The atmosphere around the fire carried a quiet understanding that every elimination now genuinely mattered. Chris handed out marshmallows slowly, clearly enjoying the tension. Courtney. She caught hers immediately. Bridget. Bridget smiled faintly in relief. Owen. Owen practically hugged his marshmallow. Only Duncan remained seated. He stayed calm, but his eyes never left Courtney. Chris smirked dramatically before announcing the obvious. And that means Duncan is officially eliminated. Owen gasped loudly while Bridget looked genuinely saddened by the outcome. Courtney stayed silent. Duncan stood slowly, shoving his hands into his pockets as though the elimination barely bothered him. "Well," he muttered, "guess stealing from Chef finally caught up to me." Before leaving, though, he stopped beside Courtney. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Duncan smirked faintly. "You stole my compass." Courtney crossed her arms immediately, defensive instincts activating on reflex. "You deserved it." Still cold. Strangely, he did not sound angry. If anything, he sounded impressed. Maybe even proud. And somehow, that made Courtney feel far worse than if he had yelled at her. As Duncan walked toward the boat of losers, Owen shouted after him emotionally, "Dude, I'll miss you." Yeah, Duncan called back without turning around. Bridget waved goodbye softly. Courtney never waved at all. Later that night, after the boat disappeared into the darkness beyond the lake, Courtney sat alone near the dock for a long time. The island was quiet except for the sound of water against the wood beneath her feet. She had finally done what she needed to do to win. And somehow, it didn't feel nearly as good as she thought it would. By the time only 3 contestants remained on Camp Wawanakwa, the island no longer felt like a battlefield so much as it did a pressure cooker waiting for the final burst. The chaos that once defined every corner of the game had burned itself out through betrayals, shifting alliances, and emotional exhaustion, leaving behind something stranger than hatred or tension. A kind of uneasy calm. Courtney, Bridget, and Owen stood as the last competitors, and despite everything total drama usually turned people into, there was an unexpected truth none of them could ignore anymore. They actually got along. Not perfectly, not without friction, but compared to the wreckage of past finales filled with manipulation and paranoia, this felt almost peaceful. Almost. Chris McLean ruined that illusion the moment he appeared on the dock, grinning with the kind of enthusiasm that always meant someone was about to suffer. "Campers," he called out, voice echoing across the water. "Welcome to your final challenge before the finale." Chef rolled out a massive spinning wheel, its surface crowded with dares scribbled in chaotic handwriting. Even from a distance, the worst ones were obvious, disgusting, dangerous, and in some cases, questionably legal. Chris gestured toward it as though presenting a masterpiece. "It's time for I triple dog dare you." Owen visibly deflated, already sweating before the game had even begun. Before the challenge could properly start, Courtney and Bridget pulled Owen aside near the cabins, away from Chris's watchful grin. The air between them wasn't hostile, but it carried the weight of something unspoken that all 3 of them understood too well. Courtney folded her arms, her voice firm but quieter than usual. "We need to talk strategy." Owen flinched dramatically. "Oh no." Bridget let out a small laugh, trying to ease the tension. "It's not bad." Courtney hesitated just long enough to make Owen's expression worse. "It's a little bad." What they didn't say out loud hung between them anyway, clear enough without explanation. If Owen made it to the finale, he became a serious problem. Not because he was manipulative or calculating, but because he wasn't. People liked him too easily. Even eliminated contestants who found him exhausting rarely held lasting resentment. He wasn't a strategist, wasn't a schemer, wasn't cruel, and that made him unpredictable in a final vote. Bridget glanced toward Courtney, her expression careful but honest. "We agreed the finale should be us." Courtney gave a slow nod, not out of arrogance but recognition. Bridget wasn't the easy opponent. She was, in many ways, the one Courtney respected most. There was no hidden agenda in Bridget, no sharp edges disguised as kindness. She stayed good in a game that constantly rewarded people for not being good. Owen shifted awkwardly between them. "So, I'm doomed." Courtney winced. "Probably." "Aman." What was strange was that Owen didn't sound angry. If anything, he just sounded disappointed in a general, existential way, like he'd been expecting the universe to eventually catch up with him. Chris wasted no time dragging them into the chaos. The challenge itself began deceptively simply, with dares that escalated in cruelty the longer they went on. Eating combinations of rotten food, plunging into freezing water, wearing humiliating costumes that clearly came from Chef's worst nightmares. At first, Courtney and Bridget worked together efficiently, treating Owen like a shared obstacle rather than a teammate. It almost looked like coordination, forcing him into increasingly absurd punishments while they advanced through the wheel's escalating madness. But Owen, against all logic, kept surviving. He gagged through rancid squid pudding and still finished the bowl. He endured freezing water that left Courtney shivering just watching. He even managed to complete a dare that involved licking Chef's armpit, something Chris later admitted should have ended him as a contestant on principle. Yet somehow, Owen remained standing. And as the dares escalated, Courtney and Bridget began to run out of ways to target each other without turning the entire challenge into mutual destruction. The structure that had held their alliance together started to loosen without either of them explicitly acknowledging it. Something was shifting. The realization came quietly for Courtney, in the middle of watching Bridget struggle through yet another punishment, this one involving balancing a bucket of fish guts while crossing a line of obstacles that seemed designed by someone actively malicious. Courtney stood still, watching more than participating, and for the first time she truly understood the shape of the endgame. If Bridget reached the finale, she might win. Not because she was the strongest competitor or the most ruthless, but because she was liked. Genuinely liked. Jeff admired her. The eliminated contestants respected her. Even those she had voted out rarely stayed angry for long. Bridget wasn't just a player in the game anymore. She was the kind of person people rooted for without thinking about it. Courtney's stomach tightened, the realization landing harder than any physical challenge. It shouldn't have mattered. It went against every strategic instinct she had built over the course of the competition. The plan had always been clean, simple: eliminate threats, reach the end, win. But Bridget wasn't just a threat in the abstract sense anymore. She was standing right there. And Courtney hated the clarity of that thought. The change didn't happen all at once. It never did in a place like this. Instead, it crept in slowly, through small omissions that only became noticeable when it was too late to ignore them. Courtney stopped helping Bridget. Not directly. Not in a way that could be pointed at or accused. There were no arguments, no confrontations, just a gradual absence where support used to be. No advice when Bridget faltered. No encouragement when she hesitated. No steadying hand when things went wrong. Bridget noticed eventually, especially during a particularly brutal challenge that required walking barefoot across hot coals while carrying a container of fish guts. Courtney stood at a distance, watching without stepping in. When Bridget finally made it across, exhausted and shaking, she looked at Courtney with something like quiet hurt. Later, she approached her alone. "You're pulling away." Courtney didn't look at her immediately. "No, I'm not." Bridget didn't even argue. "You are." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding neither of them wanted to name out loud. Bridget's voice softened. "You think you can't beat me?" Courtney said nothing. That silence was confirmation enough. While their alliance frayed, Owen continued to exist in a state of improbable survival that defied both logic and expectation. Chris seemed increasingly determined to break him through sheer escalation. At one point, Owen was instructed to retrieve a key from inside an alligator's mouth. 10 minutes later he returned, missing a shoe and covered in mud, but still holding the key. Even Chef looked unsettled watching him. "How are you still alive?"
Chef muttered.
Owen shrugged. "Honestly, I stopped questioning it a long time ago." The problem became clearer with every passing dare. Neither Courtney nor Bridget had enough coordinated effort left to eliminate Owen before turning on each other. The structure of their alliance was collapsing under the weight of the final decision. Eventually, something had to give. By the final round, exhaustion had settled into Bridget in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was deeper than that, something quieter, more final. She had endured everything the game could throw at her without becoming something she wasn't. That, in itself, felt like an ending. Chris handed her the next card with obvious anticipation, already enjoying whatever reaction it might provoke. "Shave your head bald." The camp went still. Owen visibly recoiled. Courtney didn't move at all. Bridget stared at the card for a long moment, the wind moving faintly through the silence around her. Then she slowly shook her head.
No.
Chris blinked.
No.
Bridget exhaled, something like relief and sadness mixing in her expression. "I've done everything this game asked me to do. I've been covered in bugs, chased through the forest, nearly eaten by animals, and I've lost people I cared about watching this whole thing unfold." Her gaze flicked briefly toward Courtney, then away again. "And I think I've already lost enough." For the first time in the entire competition, she stepped back, not defeated in the traditional sense, but finished in a way the game didn't know how to process. "I'm done." Even Chris seemed momentarily unsure how to react. "Well," Chris said after an awkward pause, forcing his usual tone back into place, I guess that means Bridget is officially eliminated. But the announcement lacked its usual bite. Even he seemed to understand this wasn't a typical exit. Owen immediately stepped forward and wrapped Bridget in a tight, emotional hug. You were awesome. Bridget laughed softly against him. Thanks, Owen. Then she turned to Courtney. The two of them stood there for a moment without speaking, everything they had built between them narrowing into something fragile and unresolved. Finally, Courtney spoke, barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. The words came out differently than anything she had said in the game so far, less strategic, less controlled. More human. Bridget smiled, but it carried sadness rather than relief. I know. And somehow, that made it worse. As Bridget walked toward the boat of losers, the island felt emptier in a way that wasn't just about numbers. It was something harder to define, like a piece of the game had quietly gone missing. Courtney watched her leave until the boat disappeared into the dark water. And for the first time, she understood something she hadn't expected to learn in a game built on winning. Winning didn't always feel like winning when you were the one left standing. The island, once wild and half forgotten, had been transformed into a manufactured arena of spectacle and noise. Floodlights towered above the tree line like artificial suns, washing the shoreline in harsh white glare. Cameras pivoted constantly on mechanical arms, tracking every breath, every stumble, every flicker of emotion as if the entire island had become one living broadcast. Even the dock had changed, rebuilt into an elaborate obstacle course that stretched across familiar locations like a stitched-together memory of every challenge the season had ever forced them through. And at the center of it all stood the final two. Courtney. Owen. Chris McLean stepped between them with the delighted posture of a man watching a disaster he had personally engineered. His grin never quite stopped widening, as though it might eventually split his face in half. After weeks of betrayal, alliances, pain, humiliation, wild animals, disgusting food, and emotional damage that'll probably require therapy later, Chris announced, voice echoing through the speakers mounted across the island, welcome to the final challenge. Chef raised an air horn and blasted it toward the sky. The sound cracked across the camp like a gunshot. Owen jolted so hard he nearly left the ground entirely. Courtney didn't move. Not even a blink. But inside her chest, something tightened. Not fear. Not excitement. Exhaustion. Not the kind that came from running or climbing or fighting through obstacles, but the deeper kind, the slow erosion of patience and certainty that had been wearing her down since the first day of the competition. Somewhere along the way, the game had stopped feeling like a game. And worse than that, she could no longer ignore the thought that had been circling her mind for days. Maybe Duncan had been right. Around the viewing platform, the eliminated campers had gathered in clusters, split into two uneven camps of support. Courtney's side stood more disciplined, more focused, almost like a squad that had followed her orders without realizing they still could. Duncan leaned against the railing, arms folded, watching without expression that could be easily read. Bridget stood nearby, quiet but attentive, while DJ shifted nervously as though unsure whether he belonged in the intensity of it all. Eva stood with her usual folded arms and sharp gaze, and Jeff tried to lighten the atmosphere with awkward energy that no one really responded to. Even Heather, of all people, gave Courtney a small nod, measured, almost respectful, as though acknowledging a rival who had survived too long to be dismissed. On Owen's side, the mood was lighter, louder, more chaotic in a way only Owen could attract. Gwen stood with a faint smile, Trent looked supportive in that earnest way he always had, and Beth and Tyler chatted nervously as they tried to keep up with the energy. Katie and Sadie clung together, already half invested in the spectacle of it all. Owen didn't need strategy to gather people. He only needed to exist. Chris clapped his hands once, sharply. Your supporters may assist you during portions of the race, he declared cheerfully. Or sabotage each other. Honestly, I don't care. I just want ratings. The horn sounded again. The race began. The first section threw them straight into the forest obstacle course from earlier in the season. A distorted echo of basic straining turned more dangerous under the final spotlight. Courtney surged forward immediately, her body moving like it had been trained for nothing but efficiency. Every step was calculated. Every turn deliberate. She didn't hesitate long enough for doubt to form. Her voice snapped out behind her before anyone could react. DJ, clear the mud path. Jeff, watch the rope bridge. Bridget, check ahead for traps. Jeff blinked at her like he had just been assigned a job in a language he didn't fully understand. Yeah, okay. Owen, meanwhile, tripped almost immediately into the chaos, laughing as he stumbled through branches and uneven ground. Izzy's voice rang from the sidelines. wild with encouragement that made no sense but somehow still worked. "You got this, big guy. Pretend the finish line is made of cheese. That actually helps." Owen shouted back, pushing himself forward with renewed enthusiasm. Courtney clenched her jaw so tightly it hurt. Of course it helped. Everything helped him. That was the most infuriating part. They reached the rope bridge not long after, swaying above a drop that felt deeper than it had any right to be. Courtney moved first, stepping carefully across the worn planks, but halfway through, one snapped beneath her weight. The world tilted. Her foot slipped. For a fraction of a second, she was weightless. Then a hand grabbed the rope beside her, stabilizing it just enough to stop her fall. Duncan. He didn't look at her the way he used to when everything between them carried heat or argument or challenge. He just held the rope steady, expression controlled, voice low. Focus. The simplicity of it landed harder than any insult ever had. Courtney didn't answer. She only kept moving. But something inside her shifted in a way she didn't have time to examine. The second stage brought them into the old kitchen arena from If You Can't Take the Heat, where Chef waited like a judge in some culinary nightmare. Tables stretched across the space, each one loaded with food combinations that looked like they had been designed purely to punish the human instinct for survival. "You know the rules," Chef said with satisfaction that bordered on cruelty. Courtney's stomach sank slightly. Owen's face lit up as if he had just been invited to a celebration. "Oh wow," he breathed, leaning closer. "Is that deep-fried marshmallow gravy?" Chef nodded once. Owen nearly trembled with joy. Courtney forced herself forward. Every plate became an ordeal, every bite a negotiation between discipline and disgust. She swallowed what she had to without reacting, refusing to give the food the satisfaction of breaking her focus. Owen, on the other hand, devoured everything with alarming enthusiasm, as though the entire challenge had been designed specifically for him and him alone. By the end, Courtney looked like she had survived something far worse than a cooking segment. Owen looked like he was ready for more. "How are you still moving?" she demanded hoarsely. "I dunno." Owen said brightly, "I think my stomach stopped feeling fear years ago." Courtney didn't respond. She just kept going. The race stretched across the island in relentless waves of recycled chaos, cliff diving, bike ramps, animal cages, and remnants of challenges that refused to stay in the past. Each stage chipped away at Courtney's control in ways she couldn't fully stop anymore. Not all at once, but gradually, quietly. Every mistake irritated her more than it should have. Every delay felt like an insult. Every cheer from Owen's supporters felt louder than it had any right to be. By the time they reached the final mountain climb, the air itself felt heavier. Courtney's breathing was sharp now, her hair disheveled, her uniform torn and stained from everything she had pushed through. Owen was just as exhausted, but somehow still smiling through it, as though the effort itself meant something good to him. That smile bothered her more than anything else. Chris's voice boomed across the speakers. "First camper across the finish line wins $1 million. The words landed like thunder. The finish line was visible now, distant but real, waiting like the final answer to everything. Courtney stared at it. Everything she had done led here. Everything she had sacrificed. Everything she had become. Go, Courtney. Bridget's voice suddenly cut through the noise. "You got this." DJ added quickly after. Even Eva muttered, almost unwillingly, "Don't choke now." Courtney froze for half a heartbeat. People were cheering for her, not ordering her, not following her out of fear, believing in her. Something fragile formed in her chest before she could stop it. A smile slipped through, small, real, unguarded. Then Owen bolted forward. Izzy had appeared near the finish line holding a massive chocolate cake like it was a sacred relic. "Karak!" Owen roared, abandoning all logic as he sprinted. The moment shattered. Courtney surged after him. "You are not beating me," she shouted. And in that instant, something familiar returned to her voice. Not the strategist. Not the leader. The competitor who refused to lose at any cost. Duncan watched from the sidelines for a long moment before finally stepping forward. "Courtney." She didn't stop. "Courtney." Still climbing. "Courtney." That time, she froze. Slowly turned. Duncan walked toward her, expression unreadable in a way that felt more serious than anger ever could. "Why should I care that you suddenly think I'm too much of a rebel?" Courtney snapped before he could speak. "You never took this seriously." He didn't flinch. Instead, he exhaled slowly. That's the problem. Courtney's expression tightened. I had fun, Duncan said simply. Yeah, I cheated. I messed around. Whatever. But you. He gestured toward the finish line. You're acting like this game matters more than the people in it. Silence spread outward, swallowing even the background noise. You push everyone until they can't breathe, he continued, voice steady but firm. And now you're doing it again. Courtney's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You used to be bossy and intense, he added. Now you're worse. Because now you think winning justifies everything. Her eyes widened slightly, as though something inside her had been struck but hadn't yet fallen. Then Duncan said the words that ended everything. I'm done. No drama followed.
No argument. No final explosión.
Just finality. He turned and walked away. Courtney stood still, unable to move, as though the ground had finally decided to stop cooperating with her. For the first time since the season began, the $1 million didn't feel close. It felt meaningless. Her gaze drifted across the island. Bridget.
Hey.
Jeff. People she had actually begun to care about without realizing it. And somewhere along the way, she had started treating all of them like obstacles instead of people. The realization settled in slowly. Heavily. Painfully. Chris's voice cracked through the silence again. Anytime now. The race resumed. Here are more emotionally charged versions of both endings, leaning harder into aftermath, silence, and what victory actually means rather than just who wins. Ending 1. Izzy waved the chocolate cake near the finish line like it was the most important thing in the world, her voice cutting through the wind and noise. Come to the frosting, Owen. And for Owen, everything narrowed down to that one moment. Not the $1 million. Not the cameras. Not the competition. Just cake. He ran. Not with strategy. Not with calculation. Just pure instinct, the kind that had carried him through the entire season without ever needing to understand why. Courtney followed close behind, faster, sharper, forcing every remaining ounce of strength into her legs. She was gaining. She knew she was gaining. But Owen didn't hesitate. Not even once. He dove forward with everything he had left in him. And crossed the line. The cannons went off like thunder splitting the sky. Confetti poured down in endless color, too bright for how quiet Courtney suddenly felt inside. Owen wins total drama island. Chris shouted, voice ecstatic as the island erupted in celebration. Owen lay on the ground for a moment, staring upward like he didn't fully understand what had just happened. Then it hit him all at once, and his face crumpled into overwhelming joy. He started crying. Not quietly. Not carefully. Just completely overwhelmed, laughing and sobbing at the same time as people rushed in around him. Courtney stopped just short of the finish line. She didn't collapse. She didn't protest. She just stood there, chest rising and falling, staring at the place where everything had ended without her. She expected anger. She expected frustration. But what came instead was something quieter, more unsettling. Emptiness. Not because she lost, but because for so long, she had believed that winning would explain everything. Duncan never came forward to celebrate. That absence settled into her more deeply than the loss itself. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just final. Bridget eventually stepped beside her, hesitating before gently placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to be okay right away, she said softly. Courtney kept her eyes on Owen, surrounded by laughter and chaos and people who had never stopped being able to find joy in him. After a long silence, she let out a small, uneven breath. I thought I needed this more than anything, she admitted quietly. But I don't think I knew what I was actually chasing. Bridget didn't answer immediately. She just stayed there. And for once, Courtney didn't stand alone in her silence. Across the field, Owen looked up through tears and spotted her. He hesitated, then waved. Not like a winner. Not like a rival. Just Owen. Courtney lifted her hand slightly in return. A small gesture. Not forgiveness. Not resolution. Just acknowledgement that something had ended, and something else, something unclear, had quietly begun. Alternate ending. Izzy appeared near the finish line, waving the chocolate cake with chaotic enthusiasm, shouting like the world itself depended on dessert. It's time for sweet, sweet victory. Owen slowed. Just for a second. Just long enough for the smell of possibility, or sugar, or comfort, or simplicity, to pull at him harder than the race ever had. Is that, he murmured, eyes widening. Courtney saw the moment break inside him. She didn't hesitate. Not anymore. She sprinted. Every step burned. Every breath scraped. But she pushed through it anyway, not because she was confident, but because she refused to stop when she was this close to the end. Owen took another step toward the cake. Then another. Not toward the finish line. Just toward something easier. Courtney passed him. And the moment shattered completely. The cannons fired. The island erupted. Courtney wins Total Drama Island. The sound of celebration hit like a wave, but Courtney barely heard it. She dropped to her knees just beyond the line, hands trembling slightly as reality caught up with her body. She had done it. She had actually won. $1 million. Everything she had pushed for. Everything she had refused to let go of. People rushed toward her immediately, Bridget first, pulling her into a tight hug that Courtney didn't resist. DJ followed, smiling like the outcome had been personal to him. Even Heather gave a slow, approving nod that somehow carried more weight than expected. But Courtney's eyes weren't on them. They were searching. Looking. Duncan stood a short distance away. Not angry. Not smiling. Just watching. Then, without ceremony, he turned. And walked away. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just leaving, like the story between them had simply reached its natural end without needing permission. Courtney's breath caught slightly, but she didn't call out. She couldn't. Because something inside her already understood that no amount of winning could reverse that direction. The celebration continued around her, louder now, more chaotic, more alive. But it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Bridget stayed close, noticing the change in her expression. "You did it," she said gently. Courtney nodded faintly, but her eyes stayed on the empty space where Duncan had been. "I know," she whispered after a moment. Then, quieter still, "I just didn't think it would feel like this." The $1 million was real. The win was real. But so was the realization settling into her chest that getting everything she thought she wanted didn't automatically bring back the things she lost along the way. And that was the part no one on the island could celebrate for her.